Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota, near the abandoned mining settlement of Rockerville, about 15 miles southwest of Rapid City. David Jones and I had been planning this backcountry hiking trip for months. We both worked soul-crushing office jobs in Minneapolis, and the idea of disappearing into the wilderness for a long weekend felt like salvation. David was my college roommate, the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when everything was falling apart. He had this infectious optimism that I envied, always seeing the best in situations, always convinced that around the next bend lay something wonderful. We'd chosen the Black Hills because David had found some obscure hiking forums mentioning unmarked trails near the old Rockerville area, paths that supposedly led to untouched wilderness where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. The forums spoke of hidden valleys, pristine lakes, and the kind of solitude that modern life had almost made extinct. "Just imagine it, Mike," David had said, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table weeks earlier. "No cell towers, no traffic, no emails, just us and the wild." I should have paid more attention to why those trails were unmarked. We drove through the night, reaching the dirt access road just as dawn painted the sky a sickly yellow. The road to our starting point was barely more than tire ruts carved through thick pine forest, and my Honda Civic scraped bottom more than once on the rocky terrain. When we finally parked at what appeared to be an abandoned logging clearing, the silence was immediate and absolute. "Christ, it's quiet," I muttered, shouldering my pack. David grinned, breathing deeply. "Isn't it perfect? Look at this place, Mike. When's the last time you heard actual silence?" He was right. No hum of electronics, no distant highway noise, no urban heartbeat. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the soft crunch of our boots on dry ground. But something about the quality of that silence felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. The trail, if you could call the faint game path we followed a trail, wound deeper into dense woodland. Ancient pines towered overhead, their trunks so thick that 3 men couldn't have wrapped their arms around them. The canopy blocked most of the morning light, leaving us hiking through a perpetual twilight that made me check my watch constantly. "According to the GPS, we should hit the first lake in about 6 miles, David said, consulting his phone, though the signal's already getting sketchy. By noon, his phone showed no signal at all. Mine had died completely despite being fully charged that morning. David shrugged it off, pulling out his compass and paper map. "Better this way," he said. "Forces us to actually pay attention to where we're going." The first sign that something was wrong came around mile 4. We'd been following what appeared to be a well-worn path when it simply stopped. Not branched off or faded away, just ended at the base of a massive pine tree, as if whoever had been walking ahead of us had simply vanished. "That's weird," David said, circling the tree. "The trail just stops." I studied the ground. The packed earth and worn vegetation clearly showed regular foot traffic leading right to this spot, but there were no footprints in the soft soil around the tree's base, no sign of anyone having walked around it. "Maybe it picks up on the other side," I suggested, though I could already see that it didn't. We spent 20 minutes looking for where the trail continued, before David found what appeared to be another path about 50 yards to our left. This one looked less traveled, but headed in the right general direction according to his compass. "Probably just an old path that got overgrown," he said. "These forests are full of abandoned routes." But I noticed he kept looking back over his shoulder as we walked, and his usual chatter had dried up. The new path led us steadily upward through increasingly dense forest. The trees seemed to press closer together with each step, and the understory grew so thick that we couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. The temperature was dropping too, despite the afternoon sun somewhere above the canopy. Around 3 p.m., we stopped for lunch at a small clearing beside a creek that wasn't marked on our map. David tried to start a fire while I filtered water from the stream. It should have been simple. We both had plenty of experience with backcountry camping, but the kindling wouldn't catch despite being bone dry. "That's strange," David muttered, striking another match. The flame would take hold for a moment, licking hungrily at the dry wood, then suddenly die as if smothered by invisible hands. On the 7th try, the fire finally caught, but the flames burned an odd blue-green color that made both of us step back instinctively. David poked at it with a stick, and the flames returned to normal orange and yellow. "Probably some mineral deposits in the wood," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. We ate cold sandwiches instead. The afternoon brought new strangeness. We'd been following the unnamed creek upstream when David suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened. Beyond the gentle babble of water over stones, there was something else. A sound like whispered conversations just at the edge of hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling like wind through the trees. But there was no wind. "Probably just the creek echoing off the rocks," I said, but my skin had broken out in goosebumps. David nodded, but I caught him tilting his head repeatedly, straining to make out words in the whispers. By 6 p.m., we'd covered maybe 8 miles, far less than planned. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the forest was growing dark with alarming speed. We needed to find a place to camp, but every potential site felt wrong somehow. Too exposed, or too enclosed, or too close to what looked like old animal bones scattered in the undergrowth. Finally, we found a relatively flat area beside the creek, sheltered by a ring of massive pines. As David set up his tent, I gathered firewood, venturing maybe 30 yards from our campsite. That's when I found the first marker. It was carved into the bark of a dead pine tree, a symbol that looked like a twisted human figure with elongated limbs and what might have been antlers. Below it, other marks had been scratched into the wood, scratches that looked deliberate, almost like tallies. "Hey, David," I called. "Come look at this." But when I turned around, he was gone. His tent stood half erected, guy lines trailing in the dirt. His pack lay open beside it, contents spilling out as if he'd been searching for something urgently. The whispers from the creek seemed louder now, more urgent. "David!" I shouted. My voice echoed strangely, seeming to bounce back from too many directions. I circled our campsite, calling his name, but found no tracks leading away, no sign of which direction he'd gone. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. Panic crept up my throat like bile. David wasn't the type to wander off without saying something. He was methodical, careful, the kind of guy who announced when he was going to the bathroom on camping trips. He wouldn't just disappear. I spent the next hour searching in ever-widening circles, calling his name until my voice cracked. The forest gave me nothing back but echoes and those damned whispers from the creek. As full darkness settled over the trees, I reluctantly returned to our campsite and tried to build a fire. The kindling caught immediately this time, blazing up with normal flames that cast dancing shadows between the trees. I sat close to the fire, my back against a log, and tried to think rationally. David was probably just answering nature's call and had gotten turned around in the dark. He'd see my fire and come back. He had to come back. I must have dozed off despite my anxiety because I woke to the sound of footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause every few seconds as if whoever, or whatever, was walking was stopping to study me. "David," I called softly. The footsteps stopped. I strained my eyes, trying to see beyond the circle of firelight, but the darkness was absolute. The fire had burned low, casting barely enough light to illuminate our immediate campsite. "David, is that you?" I said louder. Something moved at the very edge of the light, a pale shape that might have been a person. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, but the beam revealed only empty forest. The footsteps resumed, closer now, just outside the range of my flashlight. I swept the beam back and forth but found nothing except trees and shadows. Yet I could hear breathing now, slow and raspy, like someone with damaged lungs struggling for air. "I know you're there," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Just come into the light." The breathing stopped. Then, from directly behind me, David's voice, "Hey, Mike, sorry I wandered off." I spun around, relief flooding through me. David stood at the edge of our campsite just outside the circle of firelight. He was smiling, but something about his silhouette looked wrong. Too tall, or too thin, or both. "Jesus, David, where the hell were you? I've been looking for hours." "Just went for a walk," he said. His voice sounded strange, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Found something interesting." "Come sit by the fire," I said. "You look cold." David stepped forward into the light, and my blood turned to ice water. It was David, his face, his clothes, his general build. But everything was subtly wrong. His skin was too pale, almost translucent in the firelight. His eyes reflected the flames like an animal's. And when he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous. "What did you find?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, just some old bones," he said, settling onto the log across from me. "Really old bones, with teeth marks." The way he said teeth marks made my stomach clench. He drew out the words, savoring them like candy. "David, are you feeling okay? You look—" I searched for words that wouldn't sound insane. "You look different." His smile widened, and I was certain now that he had too many teeth. "I feel great, Mike. Better than I have in years. Like I could run for miles without getting tired. Like I could hunt all night and never need to rest." The word hunt hung in the air between us like a blade. I reached slowly for my backpack, trying to remember where I'd packed my knife. David watched the movement with those reflecting eyes, his head tilted at an angle that made my skin crawl. "What are you hunting, David?" "Oh, you know," he said conversationally. "The usual things. Deer, rabbits, whatever's warm and has a heartbeat." He licked his lips and his tongue was too long, too pale. "I'm going to add some wood to the fire," I said, standing slowly. "Good idea," David agreed. "I've always liked watching things burn." I moved toward the pile of firewood I'd gathered earlier, but kept my eyes on David. He sat perfectly still, unnaturally still, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His breathing had that same raspy quality I'd heard in the darkness. When I bent to pick up a piece of wood, he moved. David, or the thing wearing David's face, launched himself across the fire with inhuman speed. I threw myself sideways, feeling claws rake across my shoulder as I rolled away. When I came up, gasping and bleeding, the thing that had been my best friend was crouched on all fours like an animal, its limbs bent at impossible angles. "You smell so good, Mike," it said in David's voice, like fear and meat and warm blood. I scrambled backward, grabbing my flashlight and swinging it like a club. The beam swept across the creature's face, and what I saw there will haunt me until I die. David's features were melting and reforming, human characteristics sliding away to reveal something ancient and hungry beneath. Its eyes had become yellow and feral, and its mouth had stretched into a maw full of needle-sharp teeth. The creature that had been David laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Run," it whispered. "I like it when they run." I ran, crashing through the dark forest, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I ran like I had never run before. Behind me, I could hear the thing pursuing. Not the heavy footfalls of a human, but something else. Sometimes it sounded like 4 legs, sometimes like 2, sometimes like something slithering through the undergrowth. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I fled, illuminating fragments of the nightmare forest around me. Twisted trees that seemed to lean inward like grasping fingers, animal skulls hanging from branches, symbols carved into bark that hurt to look at directly. I had no idea where I was going. The trail had vanished, my compass was back at the campsite, and the darkness was so complete that I might have been running deeper into the wilderness or in circles. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the thing that wore my best friend's face. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into another clearing and nearly wept with relief. There, silhouetted against the stars, stood what looked like an old cabin. Not abandoned, there was smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. I stumbled to the door and pounded on it with both fists. "Help!" I gasped. "Please, something's chasing me. I need help." The door opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and a grizzled beard. He took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding face and pulled me inside. "Easy there, son," he said. "You're safe now. What happened to you?" The cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Hunting trophies lined the walls, deer heads, bear pelts, and other animals I couldn't identify in my panicked state. The old man pressed a cup of hot coffee into my hands and settled into a chair across from me. "My name's Jacob," he said. "Jacob Thornfield. Been living out here for nigh on 30 years. What brought you to my neck of the woods?" I told him everything. The hiking trip, David's disappearance, the thing that came back wearing his face. Jacob listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if none of this surprised him. "You've had yourself a run-in with the Wendigo," he said when I finished. "Should have known this might happen, what with all the signs lately." "The what?" "Wendigo. Cannibalistic spirit from the old Dakota legends. When someone gets lost in these woods, sometimes they don't come back as themselves. They come back hungry for human flesh, and they can wear the face of whoever they consumed." I stared at him. "You're talking about my best friend." Jacob's expression was grave. "Your friend is gone, son. What came back was just wearing his skin, and it won't stop hunting until it feeds, or until someone stops it permanent-like." "How do you stop it?" "Fire," Jacob said simply. "Burns clean, doesn't leave anything behind for the spirit to inhabit. But first, we need to find where it's made its lair." He stood and moved to a gun cabinet, pulling out an old hunting rifle and a box of shells. "You're going to help me hunt this thing before it decides to pay a visit to any of the settlements around here." I wanted to refuse, wanted to demand that he drive me back to civilization, but I knew he was right. Whatever had taken David wouldn't stop with me. It would keep hunting, keep killing, keep wearing the faces of its victims. "Where do we start?" I asked. "Where you last saw it," Jacob said, loading the rifle. "These things usually don't stray far from their first kill site. They like to come back to feed on the bones." We left the cabin as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Jacob moved through the forest like he'd been born to it, following tracks I couldn't even see. My own trail from the night before was easy enough to follow. Broken branches, torn undergrowth, and drops of blood from my scratched face and shoulder. As we got closer to my original campsite, the forest began to feel wrong again. The birds had gone silent, and there was a smell in the air like rotting meat and wet earth. Jacob raised his hand, signaling for quiet, and pointed ahead. Our campsite had been completely destroyed. Both tents were shredded, our gear scattered and torn. Dark stains covered the ground. Blood, but far too much blood for one person. At the center of the destruction sat the thing that had been David, gnawing on something white and splintered. It looked up as we approached, and David's face split into that terrible, too wide grin. "Mike," it called in David's voice, "you came back, and you brought a friend." It stood, and I could see that it had grown since last night. Taller, thinner, with arms that hung nearly to its knees. Its fingers had become claws, and something dark dripped from its mouth. "That's not your friend anymore," Jacob whispered, raising his rifle. "Whatever you're thinking, push it down. That thing ate him and is wearing his memories like a costume." The Wendigo tilted its head, studying us with those yellow eyes. "Jacob Thornfield," it said, and its voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Still living in that little cabin, playing at being the protector of these woods. Do you know how many hikers have gone missing over the years? How many families have assumed their loved ones just got lost?" More than I could save, Jacob replied grimly. But I saved enough. You've only been feeding me, the creature laughed. Every time you turn someone away from the deep woods, every time you warn them about going alone, you make the ones who ignore the warnings that much more precious, that much more isolated. Jacob's rifle cracked and the Wendigo moved like liquid shadow, faster than anything human-sized should be able to move. The bullet tore through empty air where it had been standing a split second before. "Mike," Jacob said urgently, "get to the creek. If this goes bad, you follow that water downstream until you find the logging road. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." The Wendigo circled us now, sometimes on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours and moving like a wolf. Its face kept shifting between David's familiar features and something else, something with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. "I've been watching you for days," it said to Jacob, "learning your patterns. You always come alone, always think you can handle everything yourself. But you're getting old, Jacob. Slow." It was right. Jacob was maybe 70, and despite his obvious experience, he couldn't match the creature's speed. When it attacked again, leaping from a crouch with claws extended, Jacob managed to get his rifle up but couldn't bring it to bear in time. The Wendigo's claws raked across his chest, sending him sprawling. Blood soaked through his flannel shirt as he struggled to get back up. "Run!" he shouted at me. "Now!" But I couldn't leave him. Whatever this thing was, it had killed my best friend and was about to kill the man who'd tried to help me. I picked up a burning branch from the remains of last night's fire and swung it at the creature's back. The Wendigo shrieked as the flames touched its flesh, whirling around to face me. Where the fire had touched, David's stolen skin was peeling away to reveal something gray and rotted underneath. "Fire hurts it," I yelled to Jacob. "The fire hurts it." Jacob nodded, struggling to his feet. "Keep it distracted." I swung the burning branch again, and the Wendigo retreated, hissing. Its yellow eyes were fixed on the flames with an expression of pure hatred. "You don't understand what you're doing," it snarled. "I can give you power. I can make you strong enough to hunt anything. All you have to do is feed." "I've seen what you eat," I spat, advancing with the torch. Behind the creature, Jacob was gathering pieces of our scattered gear, tossing anything flammable into a pile. Our sleeping bags, David's spare clothes, the maps that had gotten us into this mess, everything went onto the growing mound. The Wendigo noticed what he was doing and spun toward him, but I jabbed at it with the burning branch, forcing it to face me again. "You killed my best friend," I said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt anger instead of fear. "You wore his face and tried to make me watch you eat him." "He tasted so good," the creature whispered, "like innocence and trust and all those camping trips you took as kids. I have all his memories now, Mike. I know about the time you both got lost in the Boundary Waters and he kept you calm by telling jokes. I know about his secret crush on your sister. I know how much he trusted you." Rage exploded through me. I lunged forward with the torch, driving the flames directly into the thing's chest. It screamed and stumbled backward, David's features melting away entirely now to reveal the nightmare beneath. "Light it!" I yelled to Jacob. Jacob struck a match and dropped it onto his pile of kindling. The flames leaped skyward, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The Wendigo took one look at the growing blaze and ran. "It's not over," Jacob panted, pressing a hand to his wounded chest. "They don't die easy. We need to track it to its lair and burn that too, or it'll just heal and come back stronger." Following the Wendigo's trail was easier than I'd expected. It was bleeding from where I'd burned it, leaving dark droplets on the forest floor. The trail led deeper into the woods, away from any human presence, to a place where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. We found its lair in a depression between three massive boulders, partially covered by fallen logs and rotting vegetation. The smell that rose from the opening made me gag. Decomposition and something worse, something that made my lizard brain scream warnings about predators and death. "Oh, God," I whispered. The depression was full of bones, human bones, scattered and gnawed, some still with scraps of clothing attached. Backpacks and hiking gear were piled against one wall like trophies. Among them, I recognized David's distinctive blue jacket. The Wendigo crouched at the back of its den like a cornered animal, no longer even pretending to be human. It had shed David's face entirely, revealing something that might once have been a person but had long since become something else. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over a frame that was all wrong, too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. "You can't burn me out," it hissed. "This is my home. These are my trophies. I've been feeding here longer than you've been alive." Jacob was already gathering dry brush and branches, building a ring around the depression. "Maybe so," he said, "but fire is older than you are, and it's hungrier." The creature laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "You think you're the first to try? There was a group of Boy Scouts in 1987, a family reunion in 1993, 3 separate search and rescue teams over the years. They all tried to stop me. They all ended up feeding me instead." "How many?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "How many what? How many have I eaten? How many families think their loved ones just got lost in the wilderness? How many hikers whose bones are decorating my home?" It gestured to the scattered remains around its den, and I could see that some of the bones were small. Children's bones. "Enough," I said, and picked up one of Jacob's burning branches. The Wendigo laughed again. "You don't have the stomach for what needs to be done. You'll hesitate at the last moment, just like they all do. Just like—" I threw the torch directly into its face. The creature's scream was the most horrible sound I'd ever heard. Part human agony, part animal fury, part something else entirely. It thrashed and writhed as the flames caught hold of its diseased flesh, spreading across its body like it was made of oil-soaked paper. Jacob was already lighting the brush ring, and within moments the entire depression was ablaze. The Wendigo's screams grew louder, more desperate, but the flames had it trapped. Everywhere it tried to escape, the fire was waiting. "It's not enough," Jacob shouted over the roar of flames. "We need to make sure the whole den burns." I grabbed an armload of dry wood and threw it into the blaze. Jacob did the same. And soon we had an inferno going that would have been visible for miles if anyone had been looking. The Wendigo's screams gradually faded, replaced by the hungry crackle of burning wood and the nauseating smell of cooking meat. We stood there for over an hour, feeding the fire until nothing remained but ashes and charred bone fragments. Even then, Jacob insisted we stay until the coals had cooled completely. "Can't take any chances," he said. "These things have a way of coming back if you don't do the job right." When it was finally over, we made our way back to Jacob's cabin in silence. The old man cleaned and bandaged my wounds while I sat in shock, trying to process what had happened. David was really gone. My best friend who'd laughed at my jokes and covered for me when I was too drunk to drive home, who'd been planning to propose to his girlfriend when we got back from this trip, gone. "I know what you're thinking," Jacob said as he wrapped a bandage around my scratched shoulder. "You're blaming yourself, thinking maybe if you'd been faster or braver or done something different, you could have saved him." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Well, stop it. That thing killed your friend before you even knew what you were dealing with. Whatever came back to your campsite, it wasn't him anymore. It was just wearing his face to get close to you." "How do you know so much about this stuff?" I asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire in his fireplace. "Because 30 years ago, I was the one who got away. Had a hiking partner named Tom who didn't come back from gathering firewood. When he returned the next morning, he was smiling too wide and talking about how hungry he was." "What happened?" "I ran, just like you did. But I was too young and stupid to know what I was dealing with. By the time I figured it out and came back with help, it had killed 2 more hikers. And that's when the local tribal elders told me what we were dealing with and how to stop it. And you've been hunting them ever since." "Trying to. There's usually only one at a time in these woods, but Every few years, someone goes missing and comes back wrong. I do what I can to stop it before it spreads." "How many people know about this?" Jacob shrugged. "Handful of locals. Park Service knows something's off, but they can't exactly put 'beware of cannibalistic spirits' on their warning signs. Mostly, they just try to discourage people from hiking alone in the deep woods." I thought about the forums where David had found information about these trails, the warnings about hiking alone that we'd dismissed as overcautious. "We saw the warnings," I said. "We just thought they were being paranoid. Most people do. That's what makes them easy prey." Jacob drove me back to my car the next morning, after I'd called the ranger station to report David missing. I gave them a story about him going for a walk and never coming back, about spending the night searching for him before hiking out to get help. They organized search teams, brought in helicopters, did everything they were supposed to do. They never found David's body, of course. There wasn't one to find. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. His family held a memorial service the following month. I attended, knowing that I was the only person there who knew what had really happened to him. I never went hiking again. I moved away from Minneapolis, changed jobs, tried to start over somewhere the wilderness couldn't call to me. But sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep, I remember David's face as it melted away to reveal the thing underneath. I remember the sound of the Wendigo's laughter and the smell of burning flesh. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear whispers in the darkness outside my window. Whispers that sound almost like David's voice, calling my name, asking me to come outside and play like we used to when we were kids. I never answer. I've learned that some invitations are better declined. The Black Hills National Forest is still open to hikers. The trails near Rockerville are still unmarked on most maps. And Jacob Thornfield, if he's still alive, is probably still out there somewhere, trying to protect people from dangers they don't even know exist. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in those woods, and you hear whispers in the wind, take my advice. Turn around and walk away. Don't investigate strange sounds. Don't follow trails that aren't on your map. And if someone you know goes missing and comes back acting differently, don't assume they're just tired or shaken up. Sometimes the people we love don't come back at all. Sometimes what returns is just hungry and wearing their face and waiting for us to get close enough to feed. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Black Hills National Forest, near the abandoned mining settlement of Rochford, South Dakota, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day team-building retreat with my coworkers from the insurance firm. The idea had been Marcus's, our perpetually optimistic regional manager who believed that conquering nature together would somehow translate to better quarterly reports. "Think of it as an investment in human capital," he'd said with that practiced smile that made me want to punch something. But the company was paying, and I needed the time away from my cramped apartment and the endless stream of claim denials that had been wearing down my soul like water on stone. Our group consisted of 5 people. Marcus himself, a rail-thin man in his 40s who collected vintage hiking gear like trophies. Sarah Chen, our sharp-tongued actuary who could calculate your life expectancy to the decimal point. Jake Morrison, the young claims adjuster fresh out of college with enough enthusiasm to power a small city. And Elena Vasquez, our office manager who'd spent more time planning this trip than most people spend planning their weddings. We'd driven up from Rapid City in 2 vehicles, Elena's sturdy Subaru Outback and Marcus's pristine Toyota 4Runner that he'd probably researched for 6 months before buying. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something wild and ancient that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have listened to that feeling. The Rochford area was chosen specifically for its isolation. Once a thriving gold mining town in the 1870s, it had dwindled to little more than a ghost town with a few stubborn residents. The Forest Service had designated camping areas scattered throughout the surrounding wilderness, accessible only by poorly maintained dirt roads that wound through dense stands of ponderosa pine and black spruce. According to my research, Elena announced as we bounced along Forest Service Road 231, consulting a stack of printed maps and guidebooks, this area has some of the most pristine wilderness left in the Black Hills. No cell towers within 20 miles, minimal human traffic, and abundant wildlife. Sarah looked up from her smartphone, frowning. "No signal," she muttered, holding the device at various angles as if that might summon invisible towers from the ether. "That's the point," Marcus said cheerfully, adjusting his rearview mirror to make eye contact. "Digital detox. When's the last time any of us spent 3 days without checking email?" Jake, riding shotgun in Marcus's Forerunner, was practically vibrating with excitement. "I read about this place online. The Dakota considered these hills sacred. There are supposed to be caves up here that go down for miles. Some of them have never been fully explored." I was following in Elena's Subaru, watching the trees grow thicker and the shadows deeper as we climbed. Something about Jake's enthusiasm bothered me, though I couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way he'd said "sacred," like it was just another tourist attraction. Our designated campsite was a small clearing beside Rapid Creek, about 8 miles from the nearest paved road. The creek ran fast and cold, fed by mountain springs, and the sound of rushing water created a constant white noise that I initially found soothing. The clearing was ringed by towering pines, their bark blackened in places by old forest fires, creating the illusion of a natural amphitheater. "Perfect," Marcus declared, spreading his arms wide as if embracing the wilderness itself. "Team right, let's establish base camp." We spent the afternoon setting up our tents in a rough circle around a central fire pit that previous campers had built from river stones. Marcus had insisted on individual tents. "Personal space maintains group harmony," he'd explained, so we spread out around the clearing. I chose a spot near a massive fallen log that would provide some wind protection, about 30 feet from where the creek made a sharp bend. Elena immediately began organizing our food supplies with military precision, hanging bear canisters from nearby branches and establishing what she called zones for cooking, eating, and waste disposal. Sarah unpacked a camp chair and a thick paperback novel, settling in for what looked like a long reading session. Jake, meanwhile, had discovered a game trail leading up the hillside and was already talking about exploration. "There's supposed to be an old mine shaft up that ridge," he said, consulting a topographical map. "The Deadwood Gulch Mine. It was abandoned in 1881 after some kind of accident." "Accidents in old mines usually involve cave-ins or gas," Sarah observed without looking up from her book, "both of which will kill you very efficiently." Marcus was assembling his camp stove with the focused intensity of a surgeon. "We're here to bond as a team and enjoy nature, not risk our lives playing spelunker. Jake, save the adventure tourism for your vacation time." But I could see Jake wasn't really listening. He had that look people get when they've fixated on something, a kind of hungry focus that reminded me uncomfortably of the way claim investigators looked when they'd found a discrepancy in someone's paperwork. The first sign that something was wrong came as we were preparing dinner. Elena had insisted on cooking duties, and she was heating up a pot of chili over Marcus's camp stove when the flame suddenly changed color. Instead of the normal blue-orange, it flickered a sickly green, then pure white, before returning to normal. "That's weird," Elena muttered, adjusting the gas valve. "Maybe there's moisture in the fuel line." But I'd seen the way the trees around us seemed to lean away from the flame when it changed color, as if even the forest itself didn't like what it had become. The shadows had grown longer too, though the sun shouldn't have moved that much in the few minutes since I'd last checked. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Sarah asked, finally looking up from her book. She was right. The constant background noise of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, small animals moving through the underbrush, had faded to an unnatural silence. Even the creek seemed muted, as if someone had gradually turned down the volume knob on the entire world. "Weather front moving in," Marcus said confidently, though he kept glancing up at the sky, which remained a clear, deep blue. Animals can sense atmospheric pressure changes hours before humans notice anything. Jake had wandered to the edge of the clearing, staring up the hillside where the game trail disappeared into the trees. "There's something up there," he said quietly. "Yeah, it's called a forest," Sarah replied, but her usual sarcasm had a nervous edge. "No, I mean something specific, like a presence." Elena ladled chili into camping bowls, but her hands were shaking slightly. "Jake, you're creeping everyone out. It's just the wilderness. Of course it feels different from the city." "Different isn't the right word," Jake said, still staring uphill. "It feels like something's watching us." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach clench. There was something wrong with the shadows between the trees. They seemed too deep, too uniform, as if they were hiding something that didn't want to be seen. And was it my imagination, or were they moving independently of the branches above them? "Everyone's just adjusting to being off the grid," Marcus said, but he was using his management voice, the tone he employed when he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "Let's eat and get a fire going. Everything looks less mysterious with proper illumination." The chili tasted like ash in my mouth, though Elena insisted it was fine. Jake barely touched his food, continuing to stare into the forest with an intensity that made the rest of us increasingly uncomfortable. Sarah kept checking her phone, even though she knew there was no signal, and Marcus talked too much, nervous chatter about company policies and quarterly projections that had no place in the wilderness. As darkness fell, I began to understand what Jake had sensed. The silence around us wasn't natural. It was oppressive, as if something vast and patient was holding its breath. When Marcus finally got a fire started, the flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in ways that defied the actual movement of the fire itself. "I keep feeling like I'm forgetting something important," Elena said suddenly, staring into the flames. "Like there's something I was supposed to remember, but it's just gone." "Probably just work stress," Marcus replied, but he was blinking too often and I noticed he'd been checking his watch every few minutes despite the fact that time seemed completely meaningless out here. Sarah had given up on her book and was now clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "Has anyone else noticed that the fire isn't giving off heat? I mean, I can see it burning, but I can't feel any warmth." She was right. Despite the healthy flames crackling in front of us, the air remained cold, not just cool, but actively cold, as if the fire was somehow pulling heat away from us rather than providing it. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but he was already moving his chair closer to the flames. "Fire produces heat. It's basic physics." Jake stood up abruptly, his camping chair falling backward into the dirt. "I need to check something," he announced, grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the game trail. "Jake, no," Elena called after him. "It's dark. You'll get lost. I'll be right back. 20 minutes max. I just need to see what's up there." "This is exactly how people get themselves killed in the wilderness," Sarah said, wandering off alone in the dark because they need to check something. But Jake was already at the tree line, his flashlight beam disappearing into the forest like a star being swallowed by a black hole. We called after him for several minutes, but the only response was the echo of our own voices, distorted and strange in the unnatural silence. "He'll be back," Marcus said, but he was pacing now, unable to sit still. "Jake's got a good head on his shoulders. He won't do anything stupid." We waited. The fire continued burning without heat, and the shadows continued moving wrong, and Jake didn't return. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Elena announced she was going to bed. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm sure Jake just got turned around. He'll find his way back to the fire." Sarah and Marcus weren't far behind, retreating to their tents like soldiers falling back to defensive positions. I stayed by the fire longer than the others, feeding it with dead wood I found around the clearing. Not because I thought it would keep me warm, Sarah was right, it wasn't producing heat, but because the alternative was complete darkness, and something told me that darkness would be much worse. I finally crawled into my sleeping bag around midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline racing through my system. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps circling the camp. Slow, deliberate footsteps that paused outside each tent before moving on to the next. I unzipped my tent flap just enough to peek out and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, backlit by moonlight, wearing Jake's clothes. Relief flooded through me. "Jake!" I called out in a loud whisper. "Jesus, you scared us. Where the hell have you been?" The figure turned toward my tent and my relief evaporated instantly. It was Jake's height, Jake's build, wearing Jake's hiking clothes and Jake's favorite baseball cap. But something was fundamentally wrong with the proportions. The arms were too long, hanging past where the knees should be. The head seemed to sit at an odd angle on the neck. And when it smiled, and it was definitely smiling, the expression was too wide, stretching across far more of the face than any human smile should cover. "I found it," the thing that looked like Jake said, and even its voice was wrong, too deep with an odd echo as if it was speaking from the bottom of a well. "I found what was watching us." I wanted to scream, to wake the others, to run. Instead, I found myself frozen, watching as Jake Not Jake began walking around the dead fire pit in a slow circle. That impossible smile never wavering. "It's been so hungry," he continued conversationally, "waiting so long for fresh meat to wander into its territory. The old stories were right, you know. The Dakota stayed away from this place for good reason." The thing completed its circuit and stopped directly in front of my tent. This close, I could see that its eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's, and there was something dark staining its mouth and chin. "Sleep well, Brian," it said, and then it was gone, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I lay awake for the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and listening to the sound of something large moving through the forest around our camp. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, sometimes like something being dragged, and sometimes like bones clicking together in the darkness. Dawn came reluctantly, gray and cold. I emerged from my tent to find the others already awake, huddled around the fire pit and looking like they'd slept about as well as I had. "Any sign of Jake?" Marcus asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "He came back last night," I said carefully, "around 2 a.m., but something was wrong with him." Sarah looked up sharply. "What do you mean, wrong?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded insane even to me. Marcus kept shaking his head, insisting that I'd been dreaming or confused by shadows and moonlight. Elena suggested that Jake might have been injured or disoriented. "We need to search for him," she declared. "If he's hurt and lost up there, every hour counts." "Or," Sarah said quietly, "we need to pack up and get the hell out of here. Something's not right about this place. I can feel it in my bones." But Marcus was already organizing a search party, dividing us into pairs and assigning search sectors. "Elena and I will check the game trail Jake was interested in," he announced. "Brian and Sarah can search along the creek bed. We'll regroup here in 3 hours." "This is a mistake," Sarah muttered as we set off downstream, but she followed anyway. What choice did we have? The creek ran through increasingly steep terrain as we moved away from the campsite, cutting through granite outcroppings and dense stands of timber. The water was impossibly clear, but also somehow wrong. Too clear, as if it wasn't quite obeying the laws of physics that governed normal water. "Look at this," Sarah said, kneeling beside a deep pool. "I can see the bottom perfectly, but my reflection, there's something off about it." She was right. While the water should have acted like a mirror, our reflections seemed to ripple and shift independently of our actual movements. And sometimes, just for a moment, there seemed to be other faces looking up at us from beneath the surface. We found Jake's backpack about half a mile downstream, caught on a fallen log that had formed a natural dam. The pack was soaked through, but that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that it had been opened from the inside, with the zipper pulled all the way around and the contents spilled out as if someone had been trying to escape from within the pack itself. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, picking up Jake's waterlogged wallet. "How do you open a backpack from the inside? And why would Jake have been in his own backpack?" Among the scattered contents, we found Jake's digital camera. Sarah managed to get it working long enough to scroll through the photos he'd taken the previous evening. The first few were normal: shots of the campsite, group photos around the fire, landscape pictures of the surrounding forest. Then the images became disturbing. The last photo on the camera showed the entrance to what looked like a mine shaft or cave, dark and roughly circular, carved into the hillside above our camp. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the things visible just inside the entrance. Pale, elongated shapes that might have been hanging stalactites, or might have been something else entirely. "We need to get back to camp," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But when we tried to retrace our steps, we discovered that the creek bed we'd followed no longer led back to our campsite. Instead, it curved away into unfamiliar territory, past rock formations and tree stands that we'd never seen before. The sun overhead seemed to be in the wrong position, and our watches had stopped working. "This is impossible," Sarah kept repeating as we struggled uphill through increasingly dense forest. "We've been walking for 2 hours. The camp can't be more than half a mile from where we found the backpack." When we finally stumbled back into the clearing, Marcus and Elena were waiting for us. But like the Jake thing from the night before, something was fundamentally wrong with both of them. Marcus smiled when he saw us, but it was the same too wide smile I'd seen on the fake Jake. "Any luck finding our missing team member?" he asked pleasantly. Elena was sitting in her camp chair, but she was sitting too still, like a mannequin posed to look casual. When she turned her head to look at us, it moved in mechanical increments rather than the smooth motion of a human neck. "We found his backpack," Sarah said carefully, watching both of them for signs of, what, inhumanity? Possession? I wasn't sure what we were dealing with, but every instinct I had was screaming danger. "Oh, good," Elena said, and her voice had the same hollow echo as the fake Jake's. "That means he's nearby. We should call out to him." "Where did you two search?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus gestured vaguely toward the hillside. "Up the game trail, like we planned. Found some interesting geological formations. Elena was particularly fascinated by this cave system we discovered." "It goes down so far," Elena added, and now I could see that her eyes were reflecting light like an animal's, just as Jake's had the night before. "Miles and miles. You could get lost down there forever." Sarah grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Brian," she whispered urgently, "look at the fire." The pile of ashes from our previous night's fire had been disturbed, rearranged into symbols that definitely weren't random. They looked like primitive pictographs, stick figures being torn apart by something with long arms and too many teeth. "We found Jake," Marcus announced suddenly, still wearing that horrible smile. "He's waiting for us up at the mine. He wants to show you something," Elena added, "something important." Sarah and I backed toward the tree line, but the forest behind us had changed. Where there should have been familiar pines and rocky outcroppings, there was now only impenetrable darkness, as if someone had erected a wall of solid shadow. "Come on," the thing wearing Marcus's face said, standing up from his chair with movements that were just slightly too fluid. "We're all going to be together now. One big, happy team." The Elena thing stood as well, and I could see that its proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms hanging too low, fingers too long. "It's been so lonely up there," it said, "waiting so long for fresh friends." That's when I understood. We weren't dealing with possessed versions of our co-workers. These were something else entirely, wearing Marcus and Elena like poorly fitted costumes. And somewhere up in that mine shaft, The real Marcus and Elena were either dead or something much worse than dead. "Run," I told Sarah. We bolted toward the creek, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Behind us, I could hear the things that had been our co-workers giving chase, but they weren't running. They were making a sound like laughter mixed with the clicking of bones, and they were moving through the forest with the easy confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. The creek bed offered no escape. Every direction we tried led us in circles, back to clearings we'd already passed, past the same distinctive rock formations over and over again. The sun continued moving wrong overhead, sometimes jumping backward in the sky, sometimes standing perfectly still for what felt like hours. "It's playing with us," Sarah gasped as we paused to catch our breath beside a beaver pond that definitely hadn't been there before. "Whatever this thing is, it's not even trying to catch us. It's just hurting us." She was right. Every time we thought we'd found an escape route, something would block our path. A sudden ravine that hadn't been there moments before, or a wall of thorns growing across what had been an open trail. We were being pushed inexorably uphill, toward the mine shaft where something was waiting. As darkness fell again, though whether it was the same day or some other day entirely I couldn't tell, we found ourselves at the entrance to the Deadwood Gulch mine. The opening was exactly as Jake's camera had captured it, a rough circle carved into the hillside, descending into perfect blackness. And our co-workers were waiting for us. All three of them, Jake, Marcus, and Elena, stood in a semicircle around the mine entrance. They looked almost normal in the moonlight, except for their eyes and those impossible smiles and the way they stood too perfectly still. "We've been waiting," Jake said. "Jake, our new friend is so excited to meet you properly." "It's been alone for so long," Marcus added, "since the mine closed, since the last of the workers left." Elena gestured toward the mine entrance with one too long arm. "It wants to show you what it's been working on down there. All the beautiful things it's created from the people who visited over the years." From somewhere deep in the mine came a sound. A wet, grinding noise like bones being chewed, mixed with what might have been human voices crying for help. The sound echoed up from the depths for what felt like forever, before finally fading to silence. "What are you?" Sarah demanded, clutching my arm so tightly I thought she might break bones. The three things that had been our co-workers tilted their heads in unison, like birds considering a question. "Hungry," Jake said finally. "Ancient," added Marcus. "Patient," finished Elena. "The Dakota had a word for us," Jake continued. "Wendigo. But that's not quite right. We're older than their stories, older than their people. We were here when the ice first melted, when the first humans crossed the land bridge. We sleep for decades, sometimes centuries," Marcus explained, "waiting for the right people to stumble into our territory, people who won't be missed quickly." "Insurance investigators," Elena said, and somehow that hollow laugh was the most terrifying sound yet. "Perfect choice. Your company probably won't even start looking for you for weeks." The grinding sound from the mine grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded unmistakably like screaming. But the screams were wrong, too high-pitched, lasting too long, as if they were coming from throats that had been modified. "The thing about hunger," Jake said conversationally, "is that it's not just about food. We hunger for company, for conversation, for the delicious terror that comes just before the end. We've gotten quite good at preserving that moment." Sarah was hyperventilating beside me, making small whimpering sounds. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest around us had become a maze designed to funnel us to exactly this spot, and the things wearing our co-workers' faces were positioned to block any escape route. "Don't worry," Marcus said kindly. "We'll take good care of your bodies. No waste. Your colleague Jake has been particularly helpful in teaching us about proper human behavior. Though we may have gotten some of the details wrong," Elena admitted with that terrible smile. "Human anatomy is more complex than we initially understood." From the mine came a new sound, shuffling footsteps and the scrape of something being dragged across stone. Something was coming up from the depths, something large enough that its movement echoed off the tunnel walls. "Ah," Jake said, turning toward the mine entrance. "Here comes our host now. It's been working on a special surprise for you." The thing that emerged from the Deadwood Gulch mine was a nightmare fusion of everything that had once been human and something infinitely worse. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that had been stretched and twisted into new configurations. Its face was a patchwork of features taken from multiple sources, sewn together with thick black thread that glistened in the moonlight. But the worst part was that I could still recognize pieces of people in its construction. A hand that still wore a wedding ring. An eye that held human intelligence and awareness, darting frantically between Sarah and me before fixing on us with unmistakable pleading. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elena asked. "We've been working on it for months, ever since the last group of hikers found us. A businessman from Denver, a teacher from Colorado Springs, and a park ranger who got too curious about the missing persons reports." The patchwork abomination took a step toward us, and I could see that its mouth was moving, trying to form words. When it finally spoke, the voice was a chorus of different people all speaking in unison. "Kill us, please." That's when I snapped. I don't remember making the decision to fight. One moment I was frozen with terror, and the next I was launching myself at the nearest pseudo-human, the thing wearing Jake's face. My tackle caught it off guard, and we both went down in a tangle of limbs. Up close, I could see that its skin was wrong. Too cold, with a texture like wet leather. When I punched it in the face, my fist went through tissue that felt more like clay than flesh, and something dark and viscous leaked out of the wound. "Sarah, run!" I screamed, rolling away from Jake Thing's grasping hands. "Get to the car." She was already moving, sprinting past the mine entrance toward the forest. The Marcus and Elena Things moved to intercept her, but they were overconfident, expecting easy prey rather than desperate humans fighting for their lives. Sarah hit Elena Thing with a rock the size of a softball, catching it square in the temple. The impact made a sound like a melon being dropped, and the creature staggered backward with that impossible smile finally faltering. Meanwhile, I was trying to stay ahead of both Jake Thing and the patchwork monstrosity, which moved with surprising speed for something so obviously cobbled together from spare parts. Every time one of them got close, I could smell the reek of decay and something else, something chemical and wrong, like formaldehyde mixed with sulfur. "You can't escape," Jake Thing called after us as we crashed through the forest. "This is our territory. These woods will keep bringing you back to us." But something had changed. Maybe it was our violent resistance, or maybe whatever controlled this nightmare realm fed on fear and despair rather than anger and determination. The forest no longer felt like a maze designed to trap us. The paths seemed to lead where they should, and the shadows no longer moved independently of their sources. We reached the cars as the sun was rising, the real sun, not the impossible stellar object that had been tracking wrong across the sky. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get her keys in the ignition, so I had to drive. "Are we really getting away?" she asked as we bounced down the dirt road away from the campsite. "Or is this just another trick?" I didn't answer because I honestly didn't know, but the radio was picking up normal stations again, and her cell phone showed 3 bars of signal. When she called 911, she reached an actual human dispatcher who took down our report with professional skepticism. The search and rescue team found our abandoned campsite 2 days later. No sign of Marcus, Elena, or Jake. No sign of the mine entrance, though they searched the entire hillside with ground-penetrating radar. The Forest Service officials decided that our 3 missing co-workers had gotten lost in the wilderness and fallen into one of the many unmapped cave systems that honeycombed the area. Sarah quit the insurance company a week after we got back. I lasted another month before the nightmares and the constant feeling of being watched drove me to resignation as well. We never spoke to each other about what happened, but sometimes I'll see her at the grocery store or the coffee shop downtown, and we'll make eye contact for just a moment. In that moment, I can see that she still has the dreams too. Dreams about things wearing the faces of people we used to know, and sounds echoing up from dark places underground. The official search was called off after 30 days. The missing persons files remain open, but the investigators moved on to more promising cases. Sometimes I wonder if other people have gone missing in that area since then, but I've never had the courage to research it. I moved to Minneapolis 6 months later, but distance doesn't help as much as you'd think. Because late at night, when I'm lying in bed listening to the city sounds outside my window, I sometimes hear something else mixed in with the traffic and sirens, a wet, grinding sound like bones being chewed, and voices calling my name from somewhere far underground. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I remember Jake's camera and wonder what else might have been visible in that last photograph if we'd looked more carefully. What other shapes might have been hanging in the darkness of that mine shaft, waiting patiently for the next group of hikers to lose their way in the Black Hills of South Dakota? The insurance company never processed our claims about the missing equipment. Apparently, they needed physical evidence of loss, and we couldn't provide any. But sometimes I think about the fact that somewhere up in those hills, there are 3 tents and 3 sleeping bags and 3 sets of hiking gear that will never be found by any search party. Because the things that took our coworkers are still wearing them, still using them as costumes while they wait for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble into their territory. And eventually, when enough people go missing, when enough evidence accumulates, someone will organize another search. And maybe this time, they'll bring better equipment, better maps, better training. But it won't matter. Because you can't map a place that doesn't follow the normal rules of geography, and you can't train for encounters with things that shouldn't exist. The Deadwood Gulch Mine will open again when it's ready for new visitors, and the forest will rearrange itself to guide them exactly where they need to go. All you can do is stay away from the remote areas of the Black Hills, especially the old mining country near Rochford. Don't go camping in places where the cell phone coverage cuts out completely. Don't follow game trails that lead uphill into terrain that feels too quiet, too empty, too wrong. And if you ever find yourself in the wilderness and realize that your friends are acting strangely, if their smiles are too wide, if their proportions seem off, if they want to show you something interesting they found in a dark place underground, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back, because the things that wear human faces are always hungry, and they've had a very long time to perfect their hunting techniques. My name is Brian Wright, and I survived something that shouldn't exist in any rational world. But survival isn't the same as escape, because some hungers are patient enough to wait forever, and some territories extend much further than any map can show. The Black Hills remember everything, and they're always ready to welcome new visitors to the Deadwood Gulch Mine. My name is James Anderson, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Black Hills National Forest, South Dakota, along Grizzly Bear Creek, in October of 2024. I should have known something was wrong when my phone died at exactly 3:33 a.m. on our first night. Not the battery. The whole device just went black and wouldn't respond to anything. Michael's did the same thing, down to the minute. We laughed it off at first. Must be the altitude, Mike said, though we both knew that was bullshit. Grizzly Bear Creek sits at maybe 5,000 feet. Not exactly oxygen deprivation territory. We'd planned this trip for months, ever since Mike got laid off from the accounting firm in Rapid City. He needed to get away, clear his head, figure out what came next. I'd been pushing desk papers for the State Highway Department for 3 years, and the bureaucratic monotony was eating me alive from the inside. When Mike suggested a week-long hiking trip into the most remote section of the Black Hills, I jumped at the chance. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no emails, he'd said. Just us, the wilderness, and whatever's left of our sanity. Famous last words. The Grizzly Bear Creek Trail. Number 7 isn't exactly a secret, but it's not popular either. Most tourists stick to the developed campgrounds near Mount Rushmore or Custer State Park. This trail requires a 6-mile hike through dense ponderosa pine forest just to reach the decent camping spots. and the creek is the only reliable water source. We'd done our research, read about Chris Pelzarski's climbing expeditions in the area, studied the topographical maps until we could navigate the trail blindfolded. That first day went exactly as planned. We parked at the trailhead off SD 345 around noon, shouldered our packs, and started the long hike toward the base of the spires. The October weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with that particular clarity of light you only get in the mountains. Mike seemed lighter already, cracking jokes about corporate buzzwords and doing impressions of his old boss. For the first time in months, I saw my best friend smile like he meant it. The creek gurgled alongside us for most of the hike, crystal clear water tumbling over granite boulders worn smooth by millennia of erosion. The trail was well marked, and we made good time despite our heavy packs. By late afternoon, we'd reached the camping area Pelzarski had mentioned in his interviews. A small clearing surrounded by towering spires, with easy access to the creek and enough flat ground for our tents. "This is perfect," Mike said, dropping his pack with a grunt. "Like our own private paradise." We set up camp with practiced efficiency. Two-person tents positioned at the recommended 100 feet from the creek, camp stove and cooking gear arranged on a flat boulder that served as our kitchen, food properly stored in bare canisters despite the fact that grizzlies had been extinct in the Black Hills for over a century. Everything by the book. That's when the first strange thing happened. I was gathering kindling for our campfire when I found the bones. They were scattered in a rough circle about 50 yards from our campsite, hidden in a grove of young aspen trees. At first glance, they looked like deer bones, the right size and general shape, but when I knelt down for a closer look, something felt wrong. The bones were too clean, picked absolutely clean of any meat or sinew, bleached white as if they'd been there for years. Yet the surrounding area showed no signs of scavenger activity, no claw marks on the trees, no disturbed undergrowth, no scattered fur or hide, and the arrangement bothered me. The bones formed almost a perfect circle, as if they'd been deliberately placed. The skull sat in the center, jaw hanging open, empty eye sockets staring up at the darkening sky. "Mike," I called, "come look at this." He emerged from his tent, where he'd been organizing his gear. "What's up?" I pointed to the bone circle. "What do you make of this?" Mike studied the scene for a long moment, his expression growing more puzzled. "Weird," he said finally. "Maybe some kind of Native American ritual site? The Dakota used to hunt in these mountains." "Maybe." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows between the trees. "Should we move our campsite?" "Nah, we're fine here. Those bones are old, man. Probably been here for decades." But as we walked back to camp, I noticed Mike glancing over his shoulder at the bone circle, and his easy smile had faded. We spent the evening cooking freeze-dried pasta and sharing stories around our small campfire. Mike talked about his plans to maybe start his own consulting business, and I mentioned the novel I'd been writing in my spare time. Normal conversation between old friends, but I couldn't stop thinking about those bones. Every time the wind rustled the aspen leaves, I looked toward the grove, expecting to see… what? I didn't know. The fire burned lower as the temperature dropped. October nights in the Black Hills can get down into the 30s, and we were both tired from the long hike. We made plans to explore the upper spires tomorrow, maybe do some rock scrambling if the weather held. "Best night's sleep I've had in months," Mike said, crawling into his tent. No alarm clocks, no traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. I followed suit, zipping myself into my sleeping bag and listening to the creek's gentle murmur. Despite my unease about the bones, fatigue won out quickly. I was asleep within minutes. That's when our phones died. Both of us woke to the strange silence, the absence of the tiny electronic hums and occasional notification sounds we'd grown so accustomed to that we only noticed when they stopped. I fumbled for my phone to check the time. Dead black screen. No response to the power button, no charging indicator when I plugged it into my portable battery pack. "Mike," I whispered, "you awake?" "Yeah," came his voice from the other tent. "My phone just died, too. Yours?" "Same thing, completely dead. Probably just the cold. Electronics can be finicky at these temperatures." But we both knew it wasn't the cold. The temperature hadn't dropped below 40 degrees, well within normal operating range for our devices, and the simultaneous failure felt too convenient, too coordinated. We tried to go back to sleep, but something had changed in the forest around us. The creek still gurgled, but all the other night sounds had stopped. No owls hooting, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth, no wind stirring the pine needles. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against our tents like a living thing. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to that unnatural quiet and fighting the growing certainty that something was wrong, very wrong. Around what my body clock said was probably 5 a.m., I heard Mike's tent zipper. Soft footsteps moving away from camp. "Mike?" I called softly. "Everything okay?" No answer. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. I could see Mike's silhouette moving toward the creek, maybe 30 yards away. He was walking with an odd, stiff gait, like his joints weren't working quite right. "Mike!" I hissed, louder this time. He stopped but didn't turn around. In the faint starlight, I could see him standing perfectly still at the creek's edge, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "What are you doing out there?" Still no response. He stood motionless for another few minutes, then slowly walked back to his tent and zipped himself inside. I waited for him to say something, to explain his bizarre behavior, but only silence came from his tent. When morning finally arrived, I was exhausted and jittery from lack of sleep. Mike emerged from his tent looking perfectly normal, stretching and yawning like he'd slept soundly all night. "Sleep well?" he asked cheerfully. "Not really. I heard you get up around 5. You went down to the creek." Mike frowned. "What? No, I didn't. I slept like a baby all night." "Mike, I saw you. You were standing by the water for maybe 10 minutes. He shook his head emphatically. "Dude, I never left my tent. Maybe you were dreaming." I wanted to argue, but the look of genuine confusion on his face stopped me. Either he was lying, which Mike had never been good at, or he genuinely didn't remember his midnight wandering. Neither option was particularly comforting. We made coffee and breakfast in relative silence, both of us trying to coax our dead phones back to life with various chargers and tricks. Nothing worked. The devices remained completely unresponsive, like someone had fried their circuits from the inside. "Well," Mike said, spooning up the last of his oatmeal, "guess we're really off the grid now. Might as well enjoy it." His mood seemed to improve as the morning progressed, and by the time we'd packed up for a day hike to explore the upper spires, he was back to his usual joking self. I decided to let the phone issue go. We'd brought paper maps and compass as backup, and we were both experienced enough hikers to navigate without GPS. The day hike was spectacular. We scrambled up granite faces, explored hidden caves, and took in panoramic views of the black hills that stretched to the horizon. Mike's enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself relaxing despite the strange events of the previous night. Maybe our phones had just succumbed to some weird electromagnetic interference. Maybe Mike had been sleepwalking. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. We returned to camp in late afternoon, pleasantly tired and ready for another evening around the fire. That's when we discovered that our food was gone. Not all of it. The canned goods and dried foods in our bare canisters were untouched, but every piece of fresh food we'd brought had vanished. The apples, the cheese, the package of sliced turkey we'd planned to use for sandwiches, even the energy bars from Mike's pack. All of it simply gone, with no signs of animal intrusion. "This doesn't make sense," Mike said, staring into his empty pack. "The bear canisters weren't even opened. How does a raccoon or whatever take just the fresh food and leave everything else?" I examined our campsite carefully. No tracks in the soft earth around our tents. No torn packaging or scattered crumbs. The missing food had simply vanished, as completely as if it had never existed. "Maybe we should move to a different campsite," I suggested. "This place is starting to feel wrong." But Mike was already rebuilding our fire, his movements sharp and agitated. "No way. I'm not letting some clever raccoon chase us off. We've got plenty of dried food to last the week." That night, the silence was even more oppressive. We sat around our fire making forced conversation, both of us glancing frequently at the dark forest that pressed in around our small circle of light. The flames seemed dimmer than they should be, struggling against some invisible force that wanted to snuff them out. Around 10 p.m., Mike announced he was going to bed. He disappeared into his tent, and I heard him settling into his sleeping bag. I stayed by the fire for another hour, feeding it small pieces of wood and fighting the irrational fear that something was watching me from just beyond the light. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my ears tuned to every sound from Mike's direction. If he went wandering again, I wanted to be ready to follow him. I didn't have to wait long. Around 2 a.m., I heard his tent zipper, followed by those same stiff, mechanical footsteps. I quietly unzipped my own tent and peered out. Mike was walking toward the creek again, but this time I could see more clearly in the starlight. His posture was all wrong. Back ramrod straight, arms hanging at his sides like a marionette's, head tilted forward at an angle that would have been painful for a living person. I slipped out of my tent and followed him, staying in the shadows. Mike walked directly to the creek's edge and stopped in the exact same spot as the previous night. He stood there for several minutes, then slowly turned his head toward the grove of aspen trees where I'd found the bone circle. That's when I heard it. A low, resonant humming, like a bass note played on some massive, invisible instrument. It seemed to come from everywhere at once: the trees, the rocks, the water itself. The sound was felt as much as heard, vibrating through my bones and settling deep in my chest like a physical presence. Mike began walking toward the grove. I followed, keeping my distance, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run back to camp. The humming grew louder as we approached the aspen trees, and I began to make out other sounds within it. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize, the soft snick of bone against bone. And underneath it all, a wet, hungry sound like something feeding. Mike stopped at the edge of the bone circle. In the pale starlight, I could see that the arrangement had changed. The bones were no longer in a perfect circle. They formed a rough spiral now, with the deer skull at the center looking directly at Mike with its empty sockets. The humming reached a crescendo, and Mike stepped into the center of the spiral. He stood over the skull for a long moment, then slowly knelt down and picked it up. As his fingers touched the bleached bone, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant gurgle of the creek. Mike cradled the skull like a precious artifact, then began walking back toward camp. I scrambled to get ahead of him, slipping into my tent just as I heard his footsteps approaching. He paused outside my tent for what felt like an eternity, and I held my breath, certain he could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, he moved on to his own tent. I heard the zipper, then silence. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the tent ceiling and trying to process what I'd witnessed. Mike had walked out of camp in some kind of trance state, participated in what looked like a ritual involving animal bones, and then returned to his tent as if nothing had happened. And when morning came, he would have no memory of it, just like before. But this time, I had proof. When I emerged from my tent at sunrise, Mike was already up and making coffee. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but his manner was normal. "Sleep okay?" I asked. "Yeah, fine. You?" "Mike," I said carefully, "do you remember anything from last night? Any dreams?" He paused in his coffee preparation, frowning slightly. "Actually, yeah. I had this weird dream about singing, or humming, and I was somewhere cold and dark." He shrugged, probably just from sleeping on the ground. I walked over to the aspen grove. The bone circle was gone. Not disturbed or scattered. Completely gone, as if it had never existed. Even the skull that Mike had carried back to camp was nowhere to be found. "Mike," I said, returning to our campsite, I think we should head back today." "What? Why? We just got here. Something's not right about this place. Our phone's dying, the missing food, and other things." Mike's expression hardened. "Other things? Like what?" I almost told him about the midnight wandering, the bone ritual, everything. But looking at his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the defensive glint in his eyes, I realized he wouldn't believe me. Or worse, he'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. "Just a feeling," I said lamely. "James, I've been looking forward to this trip for months. I need this, man. Can't we at least stay another day or two?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. Mike seemed genuinely disappointed at the thought of cutting our trip short, and I told myself that maybe the worst was over. Maybe whatever had been happening was finished. I was very, very wrong. That afternoon, while Mike was down at the creek filtering water, I decided to hike back toward the aspen grove to see if I could find any trace of the bone circle. The grove looked perfectly normal in daylight. Just young aspen trees with golden autumn leaves rustling in the breeze. No signs that anything unusual had ever happened there. But as I was turning to leave, I caught a glimpse of something white behind one of the larger trees. I pushed through the underbrush and found myself staring at another collection of bones. Not arranged in a circle this time, but scattered as if something had been feeding there recently. These bones were different too. Longer, heavier, and some of them looked disturbingly familiar. I knelt down for a closer look and felt my stomach drop. Mixed in with what were obviously animal bones were several that could only have come from a human being. A femur, unmistakably human in its proportions. Part of a rib cage. And at the edge of the scatter, a human skull with deep gouges in the cranium, as if something had been gnawing on it. I scrambled backward, my mind reeling. How long had these bones been here? The animal bones from the circle had looked old, weathered, but these human remains seemed much fresher, still retaining traces of dried sinew and cartilage. "Find something interesting?" I spun around. Mike was standing at the edge of the grove, water bottles in his hands, watching me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. His usual easy smile was gone, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Mike, there are human bones here. We need to get out of this place right now." He walked closer, and I noticed his gait had that same stiff, mechanical quality I'd observed during his midnight wanderings. "Human bones? Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. Look for yourself." But when I turned back to point out the skull, it was gone. All the bones were gone, leaving only undisturbed forest floor covered with fallen leaves. "I don't see anything," Mike said, and there was something wrong with his voice. It was too flat, too emotionless, like someone doing a poor imitation of how Mike normally spoke. "They were right here. I saw them." I was backing away from him now, every instinct screaming danger. "Mike, what's happening to you?" He tilted his head at that unnatural angle, studying me with eyes that seemed somehow darker than they should be. "Nothing's happening to me, James. I feel better than I have in years. Stronger. Hungrier." The way he said "hungrier" made my blood freeze. There was a weight to the word, a significance that went far beyond normal appetite. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "Right now. Pack up your gear." Mike smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, stretching his facial muscles in ways that looked painful. "I don't think so. I like it here. I think I'll stay." I turned and ran. Behind me I heard Mike laugh, a sound like breaking glass that echoed strangely through the forest. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, driven by a terror I couldn't fully comprehend. All I knew was that my best friend had become something else, something wrong, and I needed to get as far away from him as possible. I made it back to our campsite and started throwing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. Tent, sleeping bag, stove. I didn't bother organizing anything, just stuffed it all in as quickly as possible. I could hike out in the dark if necessary. I had a headlamp and enough experience to navigate the trail. Leaving so soon. Mike was standing at the edge of our campsite, still holding those water bottles. He must have followed me, but I hadn't heard a sound. "Mike, please. I don't know what's wrong, but we can get you help. We just need to leave this place." He set the water bottles down carefully, and I noticed his movements had become even more wrong. Too fluid in some ways, too jerky in others, like someone learning to operate an unfamiliar body. "Nothing's wrong with me, James. I've never been better. I'm finally understanding what I'm really capable of." He started walking toward me, and I saw that his fingernails had grown longer, yellowed and thick like claws. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes, God, his eyes were completely black now, as if the pupils had expanded to swallow the irises entirely. "The hunger has been growing in me for so long," he continued conversationally. "All those years of sitting in that cubicle pushing papers, pretending to care about quarterly reports and client meetings. I was starving, James, starving for something real, something substantial." I finished shoving my gear into my pack and hefted it onto my shoulders. "Mike, you're scaring me. This isn't you talking." "Isn't it?" He was close enough now that I could smell him, a nauseating combination of decay and something metallic. Maybe this is who I've always been underneath. Maybe civilization was just a thin veneer covering up what I really am. I started backing toward the trail, keeping my eyes on Mike. "You're sick. There are doctors who can help with this kind of thing." Mike laughed that glass-breaking laugh again. "Sick? I've never felt healthier. Do you know what I realized last night? James, how good it feels to finally stop pretending, to embrace what you really want instead of what society tells you to want." "What are you talking about?" His black eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. "I'm talking about hunger, James. Real hunger. The kind that goes bone deep and never, ever gets satisfied by normal food." The way he emphasized normal food made my stomach lurch. I thought about our missing provisions, the human bones I'd found in the grove, the unnatural way Mike had been behaving. "You ate them," I whispered. "The people those bones belonged to." Mike's impossible smile widened. "Not me. The old me would never have had the courage. But I'm not the old me anymore, am I? I'm something better, something that doesn't waste time with social conventions and moral squeamishness." I turned and ran down the trail as fast as my heavy pack would allow. Behind me, I heard Mike call out, "You can't run forever, James. I know these mountains better than you do now. I know every game trail, every hiding place, every dead end." The trail was rough and rocky, made more treacherous by my panic and the fading daylight. I stumbled repeatedly, catching myself against pine trees and boulder outcroppings, driven forward by the certain knowledge that whatever was wearing Mike's face was following me. About a mile down the trail, I stopped to catch my breath and listen. The forest was silent again. That same oppressive, unnatural silence I'd noticed on our first night. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no wind in the trees. It was as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard the humming. It was the same bass note I'd heard during Mike's midnight ritual, but louder now, seeming to come from the very air around me. The sound made my bones ache and my vision blur. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. The humming was inside my head now, reverberating through my skull like a tuning fork. Through the sound, I heard Mike's voice. "The old ones are hungry, James. They've been waiting so long for fresh meat. Young meat, healthy meat." His voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing strangely through the forest. I forced myself to start moving again, stumbling down the increasingly dark trail with my headlamp providing a weak cone of light. "You know what the best part is?" Mike's voice continued, now seeming to come from directly behind me. "The transformation is so gradual, so subtle. First, you just feel a little different, a little stronger, a little less concerned with the arbitrary rules that used to govern your life." I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly fell off the trail. Mike was there, maybe 20 yards behind me, but he was moving wrong. Instead of walking, He seemed to be flowing between the trees like smoke, his form shifting and blurring in ways that hurt to look at. "Then the hunger starts," he continued, his voice now coming from in front of me despite the fact that I could still see his shifting form behind me. "At first, it's just for food, regular food. But that stops satisfying you. You need something more, something richer, something that screams." I picked up my pace, half running down the rocky trail despite the risk of a twisted ankle or worse. The humming was getting louder, and now I could hear other sounds within it, chittering noises like insects, wet, slurping sounds, and what might have been distant screaming. "The old ones showed me the truth," Mike's voice said, now seeming to come from inside my own head. "Showed me what I could become if I just stopped fighting my nature. All I had to do was feed them, bring them what they needed. Fresh meat, fresh blood, fresh terror." A tree branch exploded near my head, showering me with pine needles and bark. I looked back and saw that Mike had closed the distance between us considerably. He was still moving in that impossible flowing motion, but now I could see more clearly what he'd become. His proportions were all wrong. His limbs had elongated, giving him a spider-like appearance. His face had stretched vertically, making room for rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in my headlamp beam. Most horrifying of all, his skin had turned translucent, allowing me to see the dark, writhing shapes moving beneath it like parasites. "You'll like it, James," he said, his voice now a wet, bubbling sound that barely resembled human speech. "The hunger becomes everything. You stop worrying about mortgages and relationships and career goals. You just hunt. You just feed. It's so much simpler." I reached a section where the trail dropped steeply through a series of switchbacks. In daylight, it would have been a careful descent. In the dark, with something inhuman pursuing me, it became a barely controlled fall. I bounced off trees and rocks, my pack throwing me off balance, adrenaline the only thing keeping me moving. Behind me, I could hear Mike following with inhuman speed, his transformed body apparently unhindered by the difficult terrain. He was laughing that glass-breaking laugh, and the sound was joined by other voices, whispers and giggles and hungry moaning that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. "The old ones are so grateful when you bring them fresh meat," Mike called out. "They reward their servants well. Strength, speed, freedom from all the petty concerns that plague ordinary humans. All you have to do is feed them." I reached the bottom of the switchbacks and found myself in a small meadow bisected by the creek. In the starlight, I could see that the water had changed color. Instead of the crystal-clear stream we'd been drinking from for 2 days, it now ran dark red, thick with something that looked disturbingly like blood. "Do you smell that, James?" Mike's voice was very close now. "That's the smell of possibility, of transformation. The old ones are preparing a feast." I splashed across the red creek, trying not to think about what I might be wading through. On the other side, the trail continued downhill through dense forest, but I could see something that made my heart leap. Distant lights that might have been vehicles on SD 345. "Almost there," I muttered, pushing myself harder despite the burning in my lungs and the stabbing pain in my side. That's when Mike appeared directly in front of me. He materialized out of the darkness like something from a nightmare, his transformed body even more wrong than before. His elongated limbs moved with predatory grace, and his face, what had once been his face, stretched into an expression of inhuman hunger. "End of the line, James," he said, and his voice was like the sound of meat being torn from bone. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my own feet. "Mike, please. Somewhere inside there, you're still my friend. Fight this thing. Don't let it win." The creature that had been Mike tilted its head, considering my words. For a moment, something almost human flickered in those black eyes. "James?" The voice was weak, confused, more like the Mike I remembered. "James, what's happening to me? I can't stop myself. There's something inside me and it's so hungry it hurts." "Fight it. Mike, you're stronger than this thing." But even as I spoke, I could see the humanity fading from his face again. The predatory hunger returned to his eyes, and his mouth stretched back into that impossible, tooth-filled grin. "Nice try," he said in that wet, bubbling voice. "But Mike's gone now. There's only the hunger left, only the need to feed." He lunged forward with inhuman speed. I threw myself sideways, rolling down a small embankment into a cluster of boulders. Above me, I heard him hit the tree where I'd been standing with enough force to crack the bark. I scrambled deeper into the rocks, looking for somewhere to hide, knowing it was hopeless. The thing that had been Mike could apparently see in the dark and move faster than any human. I was trapped. That's when I remembered the creek. In all the folklore I'd ever read about creatures like this, Wendigos, skinwalkers, possessed humans, running water was supposed to offer some protection. It was a desperate hope, but it was all I had. I worked my way back toward the red creek, staying low among the boulders. Behind me, I could hear Mike thrashing through the underbrush, following my scent like a predator. Come out, James," he called in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. "The old ones are waiting. They've been so patient, but their patience is wearing thin." I reached the creek bank and looked at the dark, flowing water. Up close, the red color was even more disturbing. It wasn't just tinted red. It was thick and viscous, clearly blood mixed with the natural water. The smell was overwhelming, like a slaughterhouse on a hot day. But it was still running water, and according to the legends, that might be enough. I waded in, fighting back nausea as the warm, sticky liquid reached my knees. The current was stronger than I'd expected, threatening to knock me off my feet. I made it to the middle of the creek and stopped, hoping the folklore was right. Mike's transformed shape appeared at the water's edge. He stopped abruptly, his black eyes fixed on the flowing blood. "Clever boy," he said, and now his voice carried a note of genuine respect. "The old ones taught their servants well, didn't they? Running water does indeed provide complications." He began pacing back and forth along the bank like a caged animal looking for weakness in its enclosure. "But you can't stay in there forever, James. Eventually you'll have to come out, and when you do, I'll be waiting." I looked downstream, following the creek's path with my eyes. If I could stay in the water and make it to the road, I might have a chance. The current was strong enough to help carry me, and Mike seemed genuinely unable or unwilling to enter the stream. "You're thinking about floating downstream," Mike said, reading my thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "It's a clever plan, but you should know, the old ones have been very busy tonight. The creek runs red for miles." As if to emphasize his point, something large and pale bumped against my leg in the water. I looked down and saw the partially devoured remains of what had once been a human being floating past. The face was gone, along with most of the flesh, but enough remained to make identification possible. It was a park ranger, based on the shredded uniform still clinging to the skeletal frame. "The old ones needed fresh meat to complete the transformation," Mike explained conversationally. "Poor Ranger Davidson was just doing his job, checking on campers. He had no idea what he was walking into." More bodies floated past. Hikers, campers, anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were so badly mutilated that only fragments remained. Others showed signs of having been gnawed on while still alive. "You see, James, the old ones have been trapped in this place for a very long time, bound by rituals and wards that the native peoples put in place centuries ago. But those wards have been weakening. Modern civilization, with all its noise and pollution and spiritual emptiness, has been wearing them away like water-eroding stone." I tried to block out his words and focus on moving downstream, but the creek was becoming more treacherous. Bodies and body parts created a horrific obstacle course, and the blood was so thick in some places that it was more like wading through syrup than water. "All they needed was the right kind of servant," Mike continued, keeping pace with me along the bank. "Someone desperate enough, hungry enough, empty enough to be molded into a proper vessel. Someone like me." A partially decomposed hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw the upper torso of what had been a young woman, her eyes still moving in her ruined face, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as if trying to speak. I tore free and kept moving, but more of the dead were rising from the water now. They moved slowly, clumsily, but there were so many of them. Dozens of victims, all in various stages of decay, all reaching for me with grasping fingers. "The old ones don't like waste," Mike explained. "Every scrap of meat, every drop of blood, every fragment of bone, all of it has a purpose. Even the dead can serve, if you know the right rituals." I was surrounded now by a mob of animated corpses, all pressing closer in the chest-deep water. Their touch was cold and clammy, and wherever they grabbed me, I could feel my strength being drained away. "Join us, James," Mike called from the bank. "Stop fighting the inevitable. Let the hunger take you. Let it make you into something greater than you ever imagined possible." One of the corpses, a man in hiking gear who looked like he'd been dead for weeks, wrapped his arms around my chest and began pulling me under. His face had been eaten away by whatever had killed him, leaving only exposed bone and dangling sinew, but his grip was surprisingly strong. I fought back desperately, punching and kicking at the dead things that were trying to drag me down. But for everyone I knocked away, 2 more took its place. They were patient, relentless, and apparently felt no pain. "That's it," Mike encouraged. "Fight them. The old ones enjoy the struggle. It makes the meat taste better." I was going under, the red water closing over my head, when something unexpected happened. The humming stopped. All at once, the oppressive bass note that had been reverberating through the forest since nightfall simply cut off, leaving only natural silence. The animated corpses released me immediately, sinking back beneath the surface like marionettes whose strings had been cut. I broke the surface, gasping and choking on the foul water, and saw Mike staggering on the bank. His transformed features were flickering, shifting between human and inhuman like a bad television reception. "No," he said, his voice cycling rapidly between his normal tone and the wet, bubbling sound of the creature. "No, no, no. The ritual isn't complete. The bindings aren't ready." He clutched his head with elongated claws that were already shortening back into normal fingernails. "Fight them, Mike," I shouted. "Whatever they are, fight them." For a moment, his eyes cleared. He looked at me with an expression of horror and confusion that was purely human. "James? What? Where are we? Why are you in the creek?" He looked down at his hands, which were now completely normal except for the blood caked under his fingernails. "Why am I covered in blood?" But the clarity didn't last. Even as I watched, his features began shifting again, stretching and distorting as whatever had possessed him reasserted its control. "The old ones are not pleased," he said in that wet, inhuman voice. "The servant has proven inadequate. A stronger vessel is required." He looked directly at me, and I saw hunger in his black eyes that was deeper and more terrible than anything I'd ever imagined. "You'll do nicely, James. You're stronger than Mike was, more resilient. You'll make a much better host." I didn't wait to hear more. I struck out for the opposite bank, swimming as hard as I could through the thick, red water. Behind me, I heard Mike scream, a sound of pure agony that contained both human and inhuman elements. When I reached the far side of the creek and pulled myself out onto solid ground, I looked back to see Mike writhing on the opposite bank. His body was changing rapidly now, cycling through different forms like a shapeshifter caught in a feedback loop. One moment he looked human, the next like the elongated spider creature, then something else entirely. A mass of writhing tentacles and gnashing teeth that bore no resemblance to anything earthly. "The vessel is breaking down," he said in a voice that was now completely alien. "No matter, there are others. There are always others." The writhing mass that had been Mike began moving back toward the forest, leaving a trail of some kind of luminescent slime. As it disappeared into the trees, I heard its voice one last time. "The old ones are patient, James. They've waited centuries. They can wait a little longer, but they won't forget you. They never forget. I stumbled through the remaining forest as fast as my exhausted body would carry me. The creek water had left me feeling weak and nauseated, and I could taste copper in my mouth. Every few minutes I had to stop and vomit, bringing up what looked like blood mixed with creek water. When I finally reached SD 345, I was almost delirious with fatigue and relief. A passing motorist found me collapsed on the shoulder of the road and called for an ambulance. The EMTs said I was suffering from severe dehydration and exposure, though they couldn't explain the strange red staining on my clothes or why I kept talking about animated corpses and transformed friends. The police searched the Grizzly Bear Creek area extensively but found no trace of Mike or our campsite. According to their report, there was no evidence that anyone had been camping in the area recently. The trail registers showed no record of our entry, and the GPS coordinates I provided led to a section of forest that showed no signs of human disturbance. They found the creek, but it was running clear and cold, just as it should be. No blood, no bodies, no signs of the horror I'd witnessed. Mike's disappearance was classified as a missing person case. His family hired private investigators, and search and rescue teams combed the Black Hills for weeks. They never found so much as a scrap of clothing or a footprint. I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility for observation. The doctors said I was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations brought on by my friend's disappearance and my own exposure to the elements. They gave me medication for anxiety and depression and recommended ongoing therapy. I've been seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week for 4 months now. She's helping me work through what she calls survivor's guilt and dissociative episodes. According to her, I created the supernatural elements of my story as a way of coping with the reality that my best friend simply got lost in the wilderness and died. She's probably right. The rational part of my mind knows that Wendigos and possessed humans and animated corpses are just folklore, products of primitive fears and superstitious thinking. But every night, I dream about that humming, that deep, resonant bass note that seemed to come from the earth itself. And sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear Mike's voice calling to me from somewhere far away. The old ones are still hungry, James. So very hungry. Last week, I got a call from the Black Hills National Forest Service. They wanted to inform me that several hikers have gone missing in the Grizzly Bear Creek area over the past month. Park rangers have found evidence of campsites that were abandoned suddenly, with food and equipment left behind. They've also received reports of strange sounds coming from the forest at night. Humming, they said. A low, musical humming that seems to come from everywhere at once. They asked if I had any insights that might help with their investigation. I told them I didn't. But I've started having dreams about going back. Dreams where I'm hiking up that trail again, feeling the pull of something ancient and hungry waiting for me in the deep woods. In these dreams, I can feel the old ones calling to me, promising me strength and freedom and an end to all the petty concerns that plague ordinary humans. And sometimes when I wake up, I notice that my fingernails have grown longer overnight. The hunger is starting. I think it's time to go back to Grizzly Bear Creek. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Black Elk Wilderness, 6 miles along the Grizzly Bear Creek No. 7 trail off Highway 345, deep in the remote forests north of Custer, South Dakota. David Jones and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd been cubicle warriors at the same insurance company in Sioux Falls for 3 years, watching our lives drain away under fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets. When David found an article about dispersed camping in the Black Hills, specifically mentioning the untouched beauty of Grizzly Bear Creek, we knew we'd found our escape. No crowds, no developed campgrounds, just pure wilderness, David had said, his eyes lighting up for the first time in months. The article says you can camp anywhere along the trail as long as you're 100 feet from water. David was the outdoorsy one between us, tall, lean, always talking about hiking the Appalachian Trail someday. I was more of the reluctant adventurer, but I needed this break from civilization more than I cared to admit. My divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier, and the isolation of my empty apartment was becoming unbearable. We loaded up David's Jeep with our gear on a Friday in early October. The weather forecast looked perfect. Crisp autumn days, clear skies, temperatures in the 60s. As we drove west through the rolling prairie, watching the land gradually rise toward the Black Hills, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement. "Look at that," David said as we crested a hill and saw the pine-covered mountains rising from the plains like something from another world. No wonder the Lakota considered this place sacred. We reached the trailhead late Friday afternoon. The parking area was just a small gravel pullout beside Highway 345, marked only by a weathered Forest Service sign reading Grizzly Bear Creek Trail, Narga 7, 6.3 miles. No other cars were there. "Perfect," David grinned, shouldering his massive backpack. "We've got the whole wilderness to ourselves." The trail started gently, winding through a mixed forest of ponderosa pine and aspen. The autumn air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Grizzly Bear Creek gurgled alongside us, crystal clear water tumbling over smooth granite boulders. Everything felt pristine, untouched. About 2 miles in, we encountered our first oddity. David was checking his GPS when he stopped abruptly. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the screen. "This thing was working fine in the car, but now it's showing us somewhere else entirely." I looked at the display. Instead of showing our location in South Dakota, the GPS indicated we were somewhere in northern Canada. "Must be a satellite glitch," I said. "Cell towers are probably sparse out here." David nodded, but I noticed him checking the device several more times as we hiked. Each time, his frown deepened. The trail became increasingly rugged as we climbed higher. Massive granite spires rose around us, their weathered faces creating deep shadows even in the afternoon sunlight. The forest grew denser, the trees older and more twisted. By late afternoon, we'd reached what the Forest Service description called fairy tale land, a mystical landscape where enormous boulders balanced precariously on top of each other, and hidden grottos disappeared into the mountain. "This is incredible," I breathed, setting down my pack to take it all in. "I've never seen anything like this." "Yeah," David agreed, but something in his voice sounded off. When I looked at him, he was staring into the trees with an expression I couldn't read. "Mike, did you hear that?" I listened carefully. Wind through pine branches, the distant creek, a woodpecker somewhere far off. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard." He shook his head. "Never mind. Let's find a good spot to camp." We found a small clearing about 100 yards from the creek, surrounded by towering pines and massive granite formations. Following leave-no-trace principles, we set up our tents well away from the water. As the sun began to set, we gathered deadwood for a fire and prepared a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce. That's when things started to go wrong. David tried to light the fire 3 times with his reliable butane lighter, but the flames kept guttering out almost immediately. "This is impossible," he muttered. "There's barely any wind." On the 4th try, the kindling finally caught, but the flames were wrong. Instead of the normal yellow-orange of burning wood, they flickered blue and green, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire itself. "Probably just moisture in the wood," I said, though I'd never seen anything like it. "Or maybe some kind of mineral deposits." David nodded, but he kept staring at the flames with obvious unease. As darkness fell, the fire's bizarre colors only became more pronounced. The shadows it cast seemed to writhe and dance, creating shapes that looked almost like figures moving through the trees. We tried to ignore it, sharing stories and a bottle of whiskey David had smuggled in his pack. But as the night wore on, the wilderness around us began to feel increasingly oppressive. The normal sounds of night, Owl calls, rustling leaves, small animals moving through the underbrush, gradually faded away until we were surrounded by an unnatural silence. "It's too quiet," I whispered, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our fire. David was about to respond when we both heard it, a sound like human voices, very faint, coming from deeper in the forest. It rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost like chanting, but the words, if they were words, were in no language I recognized. "Hello?" David called out. "Is someone there?" The chanting stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. "Probably just hikers camping nearby," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. Sound carries far in the mountains. But we both knew there had been no other cars at the trailhead. We stayed up until the fire died down to coals, talking in low voices about anything except what we'd heard. When we finally retreated to our tents, I lay awake for hours listening to the oppressive silence outside. Every small sound, the creak of tree branches, the distant trickle of the creek, seemed amplified and somehow threatening. I must have finally dozed off, because I was awakened by David calling my name. But something was wrong with his voice. It sounded flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. "Mike," he called again from outside my tent. "Mike, you need to see this." I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. "David, what's wrong?" "Just come out here. You need to see this." The tone of his voice sent ice through my veins. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the cold night air. The moon was full overhead, casting everything in stark silver light. David was standing about 20 feet away, perfectly still, his back to me. "David, what is it?" He turned around slowly, and I nearly screamed. It was David's face, David's body, but something fundamental was wrong. His eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's, and his expression was completely blank. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth looked different, sharper, more numerous than they should be. "I found something," he said in that same flat voice. "Something wonderful. Come with me." Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but where could I go? We were 6 miles from the trailhead, surrounded by wilderness. "David, are you feeling okay? You look—" "I feel perfect," he interrupted. "Better than I've ever felt. Come with me, Mike. I want to show you what I found." He turned and started walking toward the tree line with smooth, gliding steps that didn't look quite human. I followed at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs. He led me to a section of forest where the trees grew so close together they blocked out most of the moonlight. In the center was a small clearing I hadn't noticed before, and in that clearing was something that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. It looked like an altar made of stacked human bones, gleaming white in the filtered moonlight. Skulls formed the corners with femurs and rib cages carefully arranged between them. At the center was a depression filled with what looked like fresh blood, still steaming in the cold air. "Isn't it beautiful?" David asked, his voice filled with a reverence that made my skin crawl. "They've been waiting so long for visitors." "We need to leave," I whispered. "Right now. We need to pack up and get out of here." David tilted his head, and the movement was wrong. Too far, at an angle no human neck should bend. "But we just got here. And they're so hungry, Mike. They've been hungry for such a long time." I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. "Who's hungry, David?" "The old ones, the first ones. They remember when the land was different, when there were many people to feed them. But now, there are so few who come this far into the wilderness." His smile widened, showing more of those wrong teeth. "They're grateful that we've come to visit." I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, guided only by my panicked memory of where we'd made camp. Behind me, I could hear David, or the thing that looked like David, following with an easy, loping gait that never seemed to get closer or farther away. I reached our campsite and dove into my tent, fumbling for my phone. No signal, of course, but worse than that. The screen was flickering between normal display and strange symbols that hurt to look at. As I watched, the battery indicator dropped from 78% to 23% to 8% in a matter of seconds. "Mike!" David's voice called from right outside my tent. "Don't be afraid, it doesn't hurt. Well, not for very long." I grabbed my sleeping bag and the small camp knife I kept in my pack, then unzipped the back of my tent and crawled out as quietly as I could. The thing that looked like David was standing at the front of my tent, swaying slightly from side to side. Moving as silently as possible, I crept toward David's tent. Maybe if I could find his real gear, his real phone, I could figure out what was happening. But when I reached his tent and carefully unzipped the entrance, I found it empty. Not just empty of David, but empty of everything. His sleeping bag, clothes, pack, all gone. The tent smelled like meat that had been left in the sun too long. "I know where you are," David's voice said from behind me. I spun around, but he wasn't there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing among the trees. "I can smell your fear. It makes the hunger stronger." I looked at my watch. 4:23 a.m. Still hours until dawn. I couldn't survive until morning playing hide-and-seek with whatever David had become. I had to try to reach the trailhead. Abandoning all our gear except the knife and my sleeping bag, I started moving through the forest as quietly as I could. Without the trail to follow in the darkness, navigation was nearly impossible. Every tree looked the same. Every boulder could be hiding something terrible. The sound of the creek provided my only guidance. If I could follow it downstream, it should eventually lead me back toward the trailhead. But the creek kept changing. Sometimes I could hear it clearly to my left. Then suddenly it would seem to be coming from ahead of me, or behind me. The sound moved through the forest like something alive, leading me deeper into areas I was sure I'd never seen before. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, I found myself in another clearing. This one was different from the bone altar, circular with stones arranged in a complex pattern that made my eyes water when I tried to follow it. In the center was a pile of camping gear that looked disturbingly familiar. My backpack was there, along with David's. Both looked as though they'd been here for weeks rather than hours. The fabric was stained and rotting, and the food inside had spoiled to black sludge that crawled with insects. My spare clothes were shredded and scattered around the circle, some pieces hanging from tree branches like prayer flags. "Do you understand now?" David's voice came from the trees around me. I spun in a circle but couldn't locate the source. Time moves differently here. The old ones have been waiting, and waiting makes them creative with reality. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness. "Want? We don't want anything from you. Mike, we want to share with you. Share the hunger, the need, the emptiness that fills everything. David understands now. He's become something beautiful." Movement in the tree line caught my attention. David stepped into the clearing, but he'd changed even more since I'd last seen him. His limbs seemed longer now. His fingers extended into claw-like appendages. His face was still recognizably David's, but the features had shifted subtly, becoming more angular, more predatory. "It doesn't hurt," he said, taking a step toward me. "The hunger fills all the empty spaces inside you. No more loneliness, no more doubt, no more fear. Just the pure need to feed." I backed away, holding the knife in front of me like it could do anything against whatever he'd become. "David, please, I know you're still in there somewhere. Fight this." He tilted his head again, that impossible angle that made my vision blur. "David? Oh, Mike. There is no David anymore. There's only us now, the hungry ones. And soon there will be you too." He lunged forward with inhuman speed. I slashed wildly with the knife, feeling it connect with something solid. David, or the thing that had been David, let out a shriek that sounded like metal grinding against stone and stumbled backward. Where the knife had cut him, something black and viscous leaked out instead of blood. "You can't run forever," he hissed, pressing a clawed hand to the wound. "The forest is ours now, every path leads back to us." But I was already running again, crashing through the underbrush with abandon. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest, and my lungs burned with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear multiple voices now. David's voice repeated and overlapping, creating a horrible chorus of hunger and need. The trees seemed to move in my peripheral vision, reaching out with branch fingers to snag my clothes and skin. The ground beneath my feet shifted and tilted, making each step treacherous. Several times I fell hard, scraping my hands and knees on rocks that felt warm to the touch. Then, impossibly, I saw a light ahead through the trees. Not the cold light of the moon, but the warm yellow glow of artificial illumination. As I stumbled toward it, I realized it was coming from the windows of a small cabin I was certain hadn't been there before. I pounded on the door, not caring if whoever lived here thought I was insane. "Help! Please, I need help." The door opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and a concerned expression. He was wearing flannel pajamas and looked like someone's grandfather. "My goodness, what happened to you?" he asked, ushering me inside. "You look terrible. Come in, come in." The cabin was warm and normal and real in a way that made me want to cry with relief. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace and the walls were decorated with typical cabin decor: mounted deer heads, fishing poles, family photographs. "My friend," I gasped out. "Something happened to my friend. We were camping and he changed. There's something out there." The old man nodded sympathetically, guiding me to a chair by the fire. "The forest can be dangerous for people who don't understand its ways. You're safe now, though. Would you like some coffee? Something to eat?" I accepted gratefully, watching as he moved around a small kitchen area, preparing food and drink with practiced efficiency. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming after the nightmare of the past few hours. "I need to call for help," I said. "The authorities, park rangers, someone. My friend is still out there." The old man handed me a steaming mug of coffee and a plate of what looked like fresh venison stew. "The phones don't work well out here," he said, "but don't worry. Help will come." The coffee was perfect. Hot and strong and exactly what I needed. The stew smelled incredible, rich and savory. I was raising the first spoonful to my mouth when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The mounted deer head on the wall behind the old man was looking at me, not just turned in my direction, actively tracking my movements with eyes that blinked and focused. As I watched in horror, its mouth opened to reveal rows of sharp teeth, and it spoke in David's voice, "I told you, every path leads back to us." I dropped the spoon and looked around wildly. All the mounted heads on the walls were moving now, turning to stare at me with predatory intelligence. The family photographs showed the same face repeated over and over. David's face, but wrong, with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. The old man smiled, and his face began to shift and change, features rearranging themselves until I was looking at David again. This version looked more like the original David, but I could see the predator lurking just beneath the surface. "Did you really think you could escape us?" he asked conversationally. "We are the forest now. We are every shadow, every tree, every stone. We've been feeding here for longer than your people have had words for hunger." I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned freely, but the door itself seemed fused to the frame. The windows showed not the forest outside, but only solid darkness, as if the cabin was suspended in a void. "The food is getting cold," David said. "You should eat. You'll need your strength for what comes next." I looked down at the bowl in my hands. The stew was moving, writhing with life. As I watched, tiny fingers and toes broke the surface, along with miniature faces that screamed silently before disappearing back into the liquid. I threw the bowl across the room, where it shattered against the wall. The contents spread out like spilled paint, but instead of making a mess, they reformed into shapes. Crude stick figures that began walking across the wall toward me. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," David sighed. "The hunger will take you eventually. It always does. Why not make it easy on yourself?" "Because I'm not giving up," I snarled, grabbing a poker from beside the fireplace. "I don't know what you are, but David is my friend. I'm not letting you have him." The thing wearing David's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Have him? Oh, Mike, we don't have David. We are David. He came to us willingly in the end, just like you will." The cabin began to change around me. The walls started to breathe, expanding and contracting like the inside of some massive lung. The mounted heads came alive completely, dropping from the walls to scuttle across the floor on legs made of antler and bone. The floor itself became soft and squishy, like walking on raw meat. I swung the poker at the nearest deer thing, connecting with a wet crunch. It exploded into a shower of black ichor that hissed when it hit the walls. But there were more coming, and the cabin was transforming into something that was definitely not a cabin anymore. The walls stretched upward, becoming a vast cavern lit by the phosphorescent glow of fungi. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above me, and the friendly cabin furniture melted and reformed into organic shapes that pulsed with alien life. At the center of it all stood David, the real David, or what was left of him. His body had been stretched and distorted, limbs elongated beyond human proportions. His face was still recognizable, but it had been carved with symbols that wept black tears. His eyes held a mixture of agony and terrible hunger. "Mike," he whispered, his voice layered with harmonics that hurt to hear. "It's so beautiful here, so peaceful. No more pain, no more loneliness. Join us, please." "No." I gripped the poker tighter, even though I knew it was useless. "I won't let them take me." "You don't understand," David said, taking a shambling step forward. "They don't take. They offer. They showed me what I really am inside, just hunger and need dressed up in human clothes. Now I'm honest. Now I'm real." Around us, the cavern filled with movement. Shapes that might once have been human emerged from the shadows. All of them changed, all of them hungry. They moved with that same gliding gait David had used, their faces serene despite their monstrous transformations. "We were the first," one of them said in a voice like rustling leaves. "We came to these mountains before your kind learned to make fire. We fed on the megafauna, the great beasts that ruled the ice. But they died out, and we grew hungry. So hungry. We learned to wait," another added, "to sleep in the deep places and dream of food. But sometimes people come to us. People like you, who are already empty inside. We don't steal. We fill." I realized with horror that they were right. I had been empty, had been for months. The divorce, the soul-crushing job, the isolation. I'd been a shell of a person long before I'd come to these mountains. The thought that they might be offering something better was almost tempting. Almost. "No," I said again, but with less conviction. David reached out to me with one elongated hand. "Don't you want to belong to something? Don't you want to be part of something greater than yourself?" I looked at his face, still my friend's face despite all the changes, and saw the truth there. He wasn't suffering anymore. The constant anxiety that had plagued him for years was gone. The self-doubt, the fear of not being good enough. All of it had been replaced with purpose, even if that purpose was monstrous. For a moment, I wavered. The poker felt heavy in my hands. How easy would it be to just let go? To stop fighting and accept what they were offering? Then I remembered something David had said before the trip, when he was explaining why we needed to get away from the city. "Sometimes you have to fight for your own soul, Mike. Sometimes that's all you've got left." I raised the poker and charged. I didn't aim for David. I couldn't bring myself to hurt him, even knowing what he'd become. Instead, I ran straight at the cavern wall, swinging the iron poker with all my strength. When it connected with the organic surface, there was a sound like thunder and a flash of blinding light. The entire illusion shattered. I found myself standing in our original campsite, alone. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. David's tent was still there. Still empty, but it looked normal now. Just an empty tent, not the rotting ruin I'd seen before. My gear was where I'd left it, undamaged. The sun was rising through the trees, painting the forest in soft, golden light. Birds were singing. The creek gurgled peacefully nearby. Everything looked exactly as it should, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. But David was still gone. I searched the area thoroughly, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. I found no sign of him, no indication of where he might have gone. His gear was all there, including his boots and jacket, which meant he'd gone into the wilderness barefoot and underdressed. In October, in the mountains. I hiked out alone, taking frequent breaks to look back and call David's name. At the trailhead, his Jeep sat exactly where we'd left it. I used the emergency satellite communicator in his glove compartment to call for help. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days. They brought in dogs, helicopters, dozens of volunteers. They combed every inch of the Grizzly Bear Creek drainage and the surrounding wilderness. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no blood, no sign that David Jones had ever existed. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. They theorized that he'd gotten up during the night, perhaps to relieve himself, and had become disoriented in the darkness. The wilderness can be unforgiving to someone who gets lost without proper gear. I never told them about what I'd really seen that night. Who would believe such a story? I barely believed it myself. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown, brought on by stress and isolation. Maybe David really had just gotten lost, and my guilt had created the rest as a way to cope with my failure to protect him. But sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call with no one on the other end. Just the sound of wind through pine trees and a voice that might be David's whispering. "I'm still here, Mike. I'm waiting for you to come back." And sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall figure standing by the roadside, too thin, with arms that hang too long. When I stop and look back, there's never anything there. The worst part is that part of me wants to go back. Part of me wonders what it would be like to stop fighting, to stop pretending I'm okay when I'm not, to give in to the hunger that's been eating at me from the inside for years. Sometimes I catch myself researching trails in the Black Hills, looking for remote areas where few people go. Sometimes I pack camping gear and drive west until I come to my senses and turn around. David was right about one thing. You have to fight for your own soul sometimes. It's a fight I have to win every single day. But I'm terrified that someday I won't want to win anymore. And when that day comes, I know exactly where I'll go. The mountains are always hungry, and they're very, very patient. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry near Rochford, South Dakota, deep in the Black Hills National Forest where the pine trees grow so thick they swallow the sky. Robert Johnson and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd been friends since college, both of us working soul-crushing office jobs in Rapid City, and we desperately needed to escape the fluorescent-lit hell of our cubicles. Robert worked in insurance, claims adjustment, the kind of job that slowly hollows you out from the inside. I was in data entry, 8 hours a day of mind-numbing repetition that made me question my life choices daily. "We need this, Mike," Robert had said when we were planning the trip, his usually bright green eyes dulled by months of overtime. Just us, the woods, no cell towers, no emails, no bullshit. Like when we were kids. Robert was the kind of guy who still believed in magic. Not the supernatural kind, but the magic of friendship, of shared experiences, of getting back to nature. He was shorter than me, maybe 5'7" to my 6'1", with auburn hair that he kept too long and a beard he was always stroking when he was thinking. He had this infectious laugh that could make anyone smile, even when everything was falling apart. That's what I remember most about him now, that laugh and how it changed in those final hours. We'd chosen the area around Rochford because it was remote enough to guarantee solitude but accessible enough that we wouldn't need specialized equipment. The plan was simple: hike in about 8 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, set up camp near Rapid Creek, and spend 3 days fishing, hiking, and remembering what it felt like to be human again. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached our campsite. We'd parked Robert's Jeep at a trailhead off Forest Service Road 231, a narrow dirt track that wound through dense ponderosa pine and spruce. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something sharp and metallic that made my nose wrinkle. Robert didn't seem to notice it, too busy adjusting his oversized backpack and checking his GPS for the 100th time. "According to this, we should hit the creek in about 2 hours," he said, squinting at the small screen. "Then maybe another hour to find a good spot to set up camp." But as we started hiking, the GPS began acting strange. The little arrow that showed our position kept jumping around, sometimes showing us miles from where we actually were, sometimes not showing our position at all. Robert kept tapping the screen and cursing under his breath. "Stupid thing," he muttered. "I charged it last night. Full battery." I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected, but the battery indicator was behaving oddly too, fluctuating between full charge and nearly dead every few seconds. When I mentioned it to Robert, he just shrugged. "Electronics always act weird in the mountains," he said. "Something about the mineral deposits in the rock. Don't worry about it." But I was worrying about it, especially when our compass started giving inconsistent readings. Robert had brought an old-fashioned orienteering compass, the kind his grandfather had used in Korea, and it should have been reliable. Instead, the needle swung lazily between magnetic north and some point about 30 degrees west, as if it couldn't make up its mind where it wanted to point. The trail itself was another problem. We were following what should have been a well-marked path. I'd studied the topographic maps for hours, but the blazes on the trees seemed wrong somehow. Too fresh in some places, completely absent in others. More than once we found ourselves in clearings that weren't marked on our maps, or struggling through dense undergrowth where the trail should have been clear. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked after we'd been hiking for 3 hours without finding the creek. Robert wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a dirty streak across his skin. "Pretty sure. The maps might just be old. These Forest Service maps aren't always updated regularly." But his voice carried a note of uncertainty that made my stomach clench. Robert was the navigator, the planner, the guy who always knew where he was going. If he was lost, we were both lost. The sun was getting low and we finally heard the sound of running water. We crashed through a thicket of serviceberry bushes and emerged onto the bank of what I assumed was Rapid Creek, though it looked different from the photos I'd seen online. Darker, somehow. The water was the color of weak coffee, and it moved with an urgency that seemed unnatural for such a small stream. "This'll do," Robert said, dropping his pack with a grunt of relief. "Let's get camp set up before it gets dark." The campsite we chose was a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, surrounded by towering pines that created a natural windbreak. The ground was soft with years of accumulated pine needles, and there was a natural fire ring made from creek stones that someone had left behind. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects, just the constant whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant gurgle of the creek. "You hear that?" I asked Robert as we were stringing up our bear bag. "Hear what?" I listened carefully, trying to isolate the sound that had been bothering me. I don't know, like breathing. Heavy breathing. Robert paused in his rope work and cocked his head. After a moment, he shook his head. "Just the wind, man. You're being paranoid." Maybe he was right. Maybe the stress of the hike, the navigation problems, the strange behavior of our electronics had put me on edge. I tried to relax as we cooked dinner over our camp stove. Robert's idea, since building a fire seemed like too much work after the long day. We ate dehydrated beef stroganoff and instant mashed potatoes while the sun disappeared behind the trees, painting the sky a deep red that seemed to bleed through the pine boughs. "Tomorrow we'll explore upstream," Robert said, scraping the last of his meal from his metal camp bowl. "Maybe find some deeper pools for fishing." I nodded, but my attention was focused on the darkness gathering around our small circle of LED lantern light. It seemed thicker than normal darkness, more substantial somehow, as if it had weight and texture. When I pointed my headlamp into the trees, the beam seemed to die after only a few feet, swallowed by shadows that writhed and moved in ways that made my eyes water. We talked for another hour about work, about plans for the future, about everything except the growing sense of wrongness that pressed down on us like a physical force. Robert seemed relaxed, even cheerful, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder into the darkness, and his laugh came a little too quickly, a little too loud. Finally, we decided to turn in. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to ignore the fact that every sound outside seemed amplified. The crack of settling wood, the scurry of something moving through dry leaves, the distant call of what might have been an owl but sounded wrong somehow, too deep and too long. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to the sound of unzipping. My tent was pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness that only exists in the deep wilderness, far from any artificial light. I lay still, listening to the slow, deliberate sound of a zipper being pulled down, tooth by tooth. My first thought was that Robert was getting up to pee, but the sound was coming from the wrong direction, from the foot of my tent, not from where his tent was set up. I fumbled for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy with sleep and fear. The sound stopped abruptly as if whatever was making it had heard my movement. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no creek sounds, nothing. "Robert," I whispered. No answer. I clicked on my headlamp, and the beam revealed my tent interior, everything exactly as it should be. My sleeping bag was intact, zipped up tight. My gear was where I'd left it. But at the foot of my tent, the fabric was bulging inward, as if something large was pressing against it from outside. "Robert," I called louder. The bulge disappeared instantly, and I heard the sound of something large crashing through the undergrowth, moving away from camp with unnatural speed. I lay there for what felt like hours, headlamp pointed at the tent wall, waiting for whatever it was to come back. When morning finally came, I crawled out of my tent to find Robert already up, tending a small fire and brewing coffee in his metal camp cup. He looked tired, his hair disheveled and dark circles under his eyes, but he smiled when he saw me. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Did you hear anything last night? Like something moving around camp?" Robert frowned, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. "No, nothing. Why?" I told him about the unzipping sound, the bulge in my tent wall, the crash in the woods. As I talked, his frown deepened. "Probably just a curious raccoon or something," he said finally. "They're attracted to food smells, and they're smart enough to work zippers." It was a rational explanation, but something about Robert's tone bothered me. He wasn't looking at me while he talked, instead staring into his coffee as if it contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. We broke camp after breakfast and headed upstream, looking for the deeper pools Robert had mentioned. The creek led us through a narrow canyon where the walls rose steeply on both sides, covered in moss and ferns that created a green twilight even in full daylight. The sound of our boots on the rocky stream bed echoed strangely, coming back to us distorted and delayed. About a mile upstream, we found what we were looking for: a series of deep pools connected by small waterfalls, perfect for trout fishing. We set up our gear and spent the morning casting into the clear water, and for a few hours, everything felt normal again. Robert caught 3 rainbow trout, and I managed to land a decent-sized brown trout that we decided to keep for lunch. "See?" Robert said as we cleaned our fish on a flat rock beside the stream. "This is what we needed. Just us in the wilderness, no complications." But even as he spoke, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he worked his fillet knife. When I asked if he was okay, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired, I guess. Didn't sleep well either." We cooked our fish over a small fire, and they tasted better than any restaurant meal I'd ever had. The normalcy of it, friends sharing a meal in the wilderness, helped ease the tension that had been building in my chest since the night before. After lunch, Robert announced he was going to explore further upstream while I stayed at the pools to fish some more. He shouldered his day pack and disappeared around a bend in the canyon, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. That was the last time I saw the real Robert. I fished for another hour, catching and releasing several small trout, enjoying the solitude and the hypnotic rhythm of casting and retrieving. The sun was warm on my shoulders and the sound of the water over the rocks was soothing. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt truly relaxed. Then I heard Robert calling my name. "Mike! Mike! Come here! You have to see this!" His voice echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. I reeled in my line and climbed up the rocky stream bed, following the sound of his voice. "Where are you?" I called back. "Up here. Keep coming." I rounded the bend where I'd last seen him and found myself in a wider section of the canyon. The creek pooled here in a natural amphitheater surrounded by high stone walls. Petroglyphs covered the rock faces, ancient symbols carved by the Dakota or some even earlier people. Spirals and animal figures and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when I looked at them directly. "Robert!" I called again. "Down here." I looked down and saw him standing knee-deep in the pool at the center of the amphitheater. His back was to me and he was perfectly still, staring up at something on the far wall. "What are you looking at?" I called. He didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. I scrambled down the rocky slope to the edge of the pool. "Robert, what's wrong?" When he finally turned around, I almost screamed. It was Robert's face, but something was wrong with it. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes, his bright green eyes, had gone completely black. Not just the pupils, but the irises and whites as well, like pools of oil in his skull. His mouth was open slightly, and I could see that his teeth had become pointed, filed or grown into sharp triangular points that looked designed for tearing flesh. "Found something," he said, and his voice was different too. Deeper, with an echo that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Something wonderful." I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. "Robert, what happened to you? What's wrong?" He smiled then, a horrible expression that showed too many of those pointed teeth. "Nothing's wrong, Mike. Everything's perfect now. The hunger is finally satisfied." He took a step toward me, water streaming from his clothes, and I saw that his fingernails had grown into claws, black, curved talons that glinted in the filtered sunlight. I ran. I scrambled up the rocky slope, slipping and sliding on loose stones, while behind me I heard Robert, or the thing that had been Robert, climbing out of the pool with wet, slapping sounds. I didn't look back until I reached the top of the canyon wall, and when I did, I saw him standing at the bottom, looking up at me with those terrible black eyes. "Where are you going, Mike?" he called, and his voice carried perfectly despite the distance. "Don't you want to see what I found? Don't you want to be like me?" I turned and ran blindly through the forest, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I had no idea where I was going, no plan except to get as far away from that thing as possible. My rational mind tried to explain what I'd seen. Hallucination brought on by stress, carbon monoxide poisoning from the camp stove, some kind of psychological break. But my primitive brain knew better. Whatever I'd encountered down in that pool wasn't human anymore. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against a massive pine tree. When I looked around, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest looked the same in every direction, endless rows of pine trees marching up and down the rolling hills of the Black Hills. I could hear water nearby, but I couldn't tell if it was the same creek or a different one. My phone was dead, the screen black and unresponsive. My GPS was in my pack back at camp, assuming I could even find camp again. I was lost in the wilderness with something that looked like my best friend hunting me through the trees. As the sun began to set, I heard Robert calling my name from somewhere in the distance. "Mike, where are you? I'm worried about you." The voice sounded normal now, concerned, exactly like the Robert I'd known for 8 years. For a moment, I almost answered, almost convinced myself that what I'd seen in the canyon had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Then I heard him again, from a completely different direction. "Mike, come back to camp. I found our way out." And again, from somewhere behind me, "Mike, I'm hurt. I need help." Each voice was identical, but they were coming from at least 3 different locations simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't just pretending to be Robert. It was multiple things, or one thing that could be in multiple places at once. I pressed myself against the tree trunk and tried to think. I needed to find our camp, get my gear, and figure out how to navigate back to the car. But first, I had to survive the night. The voices continued calling as darkness fell, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, always perfectly mimicking Robert's speech patterns and inflections. But I noticed they never came closer to where I was hiding. Either they couldn't pinpoint my location, or they were trying to draw me out into the open. I must have dozed off despite my terror because I woke to the sound of something large moving through the trees nearby. The footsteps were wrong, too heavy for a human, with an irregular rhythm like something that wasn't quite used to walking upright. Through the darkness, I could see a pale figure moving between the trees. It was vaguely human-shaped but elongated, as if someone had taken a person and stretched them like taffy. The arms hung down past the knees, and the head was too large for the narrow shoulders. As it moved, I could hear it sniffing the air with wet, snorting sounds. It passed within 20 feet of my hiding spot, close enough that I could smell it. A rotten, meaty stench like an old kill left too long in the sun. I held my breath until my lungs burned, not daring to move until the sounds faded into the distance. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and beginning to hallucinate from stress and sleep deprivation. But I was alive, and that had to count for something. I spent the day trying to find our campsite, using the sun for navigation and following what I hoped were our tracks from the day before. Everything looked different in daylight, and more than once I found myself walking in circles, recognizing the same distinctive rock formations or fallen logs. The voices started again around noon. "Mike, I found water. Fresh, clean water. Mike, there's a ranger station just over this hill. Mike, I can see the road. We're almost out." Each time, the voice came from a different direction, and each time it sounded exactly like Robert. But I'd learned my lesson. I ignored them all and kept walking. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled across our campsite. The tents were still standing, our gear scattered around the cold fire ring exactly as we'd left it. But something was wrong with the scene. Everything was too neat, too undisturbed. After a day and night in the wilderness, there should have been signs of animals investigating our camp, scuff marks in the dirt, maybe some scattered food if we'd been careless with our bear precautions. Instead, it looked like a movie set, perfect and artificial. I approached cautiously, every sense on high alert. My pack was where I'd left it, and when I checked inside, everything was accounted for: water, emergency food, first aid kit, GPS unit. The GPS showed a clear satellite lock and indicated we were about 8 miles from our parking spot, northeast of our current position. I was stuffing supplies into my day pack when I heard Robert's voice from inside his tent. "Mike, is that you? Thank God, I've been so worried." The voice was muffled by the tent fabric, but unmistakably Robert's. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe stress and exhaustion had made me see things that weren't there. Maybe Robert had been hurt or sick, and what I'd interpreted as supernatural was actually some kind of medical emergency. "Robert," I called. "Are you okay? What happened yesterday?" "I don't remember," came the reply. "I think I hit my head on something. I've been in and out of consciousness. Can you help me out of here? I think my zipper's stuck." I approached the tent slowly. It was zipped shut, and I could see the vague outline of a human figure inside. But something about the proportions looked wrong. Too tall, too thin, like the thing I'd seen moving through the trees during the night. "I'm going to open the zipper from out here," I said. "Thank you. I feel so weak." I grabbed the zipper tab and slowly pulled it down. As the opening widened, I could see pale skin, dark hair, what looked like Robert's familiar green hiking shirt. But there was a smell coming from inside the tent, that same rotten meat stench I'd encountered in the darkness. When the zipper was halfway down, the thing inside moved. It wasn't human movement. It was like watching a spider unfold its legs, all wrong angles and unnatural joints. A hand emerged from the opening, but the fingers were too long and ended in those black claws I'd seen before. Then came an arm that bent in too many places, followed by a head that turned to look at me with those terrible black eyes. "Hello, Mike," it said in Robert's voice, smiling with Robert's face. "I've been waiting for you." I dropped the zipper and ran. Behind me, I heard the tent exploding outward as the thing forced its way through the opening. It was making sounds now, not Robert's voice anymore, but something else entirely. A chittering, clicking noise like an enormous insect, mixed with a low growling that seemed to come from deep underground. I crashed through the forest with my day pack bouncing against my back, following the GPS coordinates toward our parking spot. The device showed I was heading in the right direction, but the distance seemed to be increasing instead of decreasing. After running for what felt like an hour, I was somehow farther from the car than when I'd started. I stopped to check the GPS again and realized what was happening. The coordinates were changing, subtly but continuously, as if something was interfering with the satellite signals. The device wasn't showing me the way to safety. It was leading me deeper into the wilderness. I threw the GPS into the woods and tried to navigate by sun position and landscape features, but everything looked wrong. Hills that should have been on my left were on my right. Valleys appeared where none should exist. The forest itself seemed to be shifting around me, rearranging itself to keep me lost and alone. As the sun began to set again, I heard Robert's voice calling from multiple directions simultaneously. "Mike, you can't run forever. Mike, I just want to talk. Mike, I can help you understand." The voices were closer now, coming from just beyond my line of sight. Sometimes I caught glimpses of pale figures moving between the trees, always at the edge of my vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. I found a defensible position, a rocky outcrop with good sight lines in all directions, and settled in for another night. My water was running low, and I'd eaten the last of my emergency rations. If I didn't find a way out soon, dehydration and starvation would finish what the things in the forest had started. The attack came just after midnight. I'd been dozing fitfully when something grabbed my ankle and yanked me off the rock. I found myself face to face with one of the pale figures, and in the dim starlight I could see it clearly for the first time. It had Robert's face, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The features were in the right places, but wrong somehow. The nose too narrow, the mouth too wide, the eyes too far apart. Its body was emaciated, all jutting bones and taut skin, but the hands were oversized with those terrible claws. "I found you," it said in Robert's voice, but the mouth movements didn't match the words. I kicked at its face with my free foot, feeling my boot connect with something that gave way with a wet, cracking sound. The thing released my ankle and staggered backward, making that chittering insect noise. Black fluid dripped from what had been its nose. I scrambled to my feet and ran, but within seconds I was surrounded. They emerged from behind trees and rocks, at least 6 of them, all wearing Robert's face with slight variations. Some were taller, some shorter, but all had that same stretched, wrong appearance. "You can't escape us, Mike," they said in unison, their voices creating an awful harmony. "We know these woods. We are these woods." One of them stepped forward, and I realized it looked more like the real Robert than the others. Same height, same build, even the same clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. But when it smiled, I could see the pointed teeth. "I found something wonderful in that pool," it said. "Something that's been waiting here for centuries, hungry and patient. It showed me what I could become, what we could become together." "What happened to Robert?" I demanded. "What did you do to him?" The thing that looked like my friend tilted its head, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something human in those black eyes. "I am Robert," it said, "and I'm not Robert. I'm something better, something that doesn't need food or water or sleep, something that feeds on fear and meat and the marrow inside bones." It took a step closer, and the others began to circle around me. "You can join us, Mike. Let us show you what we found in the pool. Let us show you how to shed that weak human shell and become something perfect." "No," I said, backing toward the edge of the rocky outcrop. "Whatever you are, you're not my friend." The Robert thing's face twisted into an expression of rage and hurt that was disturbingly familiar. It was exactly the look Robert got when someone questioned his decisions or doubted his judgment. "I'm trying to help you," it snarled. "I'm offering you eternity, and you're throwing it away for what? A few more years of that pathetic human existence?" Behind it, the other creatures were getting closer, their claws clicking against the stone as they moved. I could smell their collective stench now, so strong it made my eyes water. I had one chance. I pulled out my camping knife, a 4-inch fixed blade that Robert had given me for my birthday 3 years ago, and held it in front of me like a talisman. "Stay back," I warned. The Robert thing laughed, but it was wrong, too high-pitched and lasting too long. "You think that little knife will hurt us? We're beyond pain now, Mike. Beyond fear. Beyond death." But I noticed the others had stopped advancing. They were staring at the blade with something that might have been wariness. "Iron," I said, remembering fragments of folklore from childhood. "You don't like iron, do you?" The Robert thing's smile faltered. "Don't be ridiculous. We're not some fairy tale monsters. We're evolution, Mike. The next step." But its voice carried a note of uncertainty, and the others were definitely keeping their distance from the knife. I slashed at the nearest creature, a tall, thin version of Robert with elongated limbs. The blade caught it across the chest, and it shrieked, not with Robert's voice, but with something that sounded like tearing metal. Where the iron had touched its flesh, the skin blackened and began to smoke. The thing staggered backward, clutching at the wound, and I saw my chance. I charged toward the gap it had left in their circle, knife extended in front of me. The creatures scrambled to get out of my way, their earlier confidence evaporating. I made it to the edge of the forest before they recovered enough to pursue me. What followed was the longest night of my life. I ran through the darkness, guided only by starlight and the sound of running water that I hoped would lead me back to civilization. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, calling my name in Robert's voice, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, sometimes screaming with inhuman rage. The iron knife kept them at bay when they got too close, but I could feel their presence like a physical weight pressing down on me. They were hurting me, I realized, trying to drive me towards something. Every time I tried to change direction, they would appear to block my path, forcing me to continue in the direction they wanted me to go. Dawn was breaking when I finally understood where they were leading me. I emerged from the forest onto the bank of the same dark creek where this nightmare had begun, but farther downstream from our original campsite. The water here was deeper, forming a natural pool that reflected the pale morning sky like black glass. The creatures emerged from the trees around me, no longer trying to hide their true nature. They moved with jerky, unnatural gaits, their bodies shifting and changing as I watched. Some grew taller, their limbs stretching like rubber. Others seemed to melt and reform, faces flowing like wax. The Robert thing stepped forward, and now it looked nothing like my friend. Its face was a constantly shifting mass of features. Sometimes Robert's eyes, sometimes his nose, sometimes his mouth, but never in the right combination. It was like watching a broken video signal, fragments of a familiar image mixed with static and distortion. "This is where it ends, Mike," it said, and its voice was a chorus of Robert speaking slightly out of sync. "This is where you join us." "What's in the pool?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Hunger," it replied. "Ancient, eternal hunger. It's been waiting here since before your people came to these lands, waiting for someone strong enough to carry it forward. Robert was perfect. Young, healthy, isolated from help, and now you'll be perfect too." I looked at the dark water and saw something moving beneath the surface. Not fish or any natural creature, but something vast and formless that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. "What are you?" I whispered. "We are the Wendigo," the thing said, and suddenly all the childhood stories came flooding back. Dakota legends of cannibalistic spirits that inhabited the remote places of the world, creatures of endless hunger that could never be satisfied. We are what humans become when they taste the forbidden flesh, when they let the hunger consume them completely. I understood then what had happened to Robert in that canyon pool. He'd found something down there, something that had been waiting for centuries for a new host. It had infected him, transformed him, turned him into one of these abominations. "But Robert wouldn't," I started to say. "Robert was hungry, Mike. Hungry for more than food. Hungry for purpose, for meaning, for something to fill the emptiness inside him. We gave him that. We can give it to you too." The creatures began to close in again, but more slowly this time, savoring the moment. I held the iron knife in front of me, but my arm was shaking with exhaustion. I'd been running for hours and adrenaline could only carry me so far. "Last chance, Mike," the Robert thing said. "Join us willingly, and the transformation will be easier. Fight us, and we'll drag you into that pool, kicking and screaming." I looked at the dark water, at the ancient hunger writhing beneath its surface, and made my choice. Instead of backing away from the pool, I stepped toward it. The creatures stopped advancing, confused by my apparent surrender. The Robert thing tilted its malformed head, black eyes glittering with alien intelligence. "Good," it said. "You're finally being smart." I took another step toward the water's edge, then another. When I was close enough to see my reflection in the dark surface, I raised the iron knife high above my head. "This is for Robert," I said. Then I drove the blade down into the pool. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The water began to boil around the knife, sending up clouds of steam that smelled like sulfur and rotting meat. Something enormous writhed beneath the surface, thrashing in obvious agony. The creatures around me began to scream, not with Robert's voice anymore, but with sounds that hurt to hear, like fingernails on glass amplified 1,000 times. The Robert thing staggered toward me, its form beginning to collapse and shift. "What have you done?" it shrieked. I drove the knife deeper into whatever was lurking in the pool's depths. The blade was glowing now, white-hot with some kind of energy that made the water around it sizzle and pop. The creature beneath the surface gave one final, convulsive thrash, then went still. The effect on the Wendigo was immediate. They began to dissolve, their stolen flesh melting away like snow in a fire. The Robert thing was the last to go, its face cycling through dozens of expressions: rage, fear, confusion, and finally something that might have been relief. "Thank you," it whispered in Robert's voice, and for a moment I saw my friend's green eyes looking out at me from that disintegrating mass. Then it was gone, crumbling to ash that the morning wind scattered through the trees. I stood alone by the pool, watching as the dark water gradually cleared to reveal an ordinary creek bottom, rocks and sand and a few surprised-looking trout. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest like a suffocating blanket began to lift, replaced by normal wilderness sounds: birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. My GPS started working again. The walk back to our car took 6 hours, but it felt like a leisurely stroll compared to the nightmare I'd just survived. I found Robert's body in a small clearing about a mile from the pool, or what was left of it. The Wendigo had taken what it needed and left the rest, but there was enough for a proper burial when the authorities arrived. I told the park rangers and the sheriff's deputies a edited version of the truth, that Robert had fallen into the creek and drowned, that I'd gotten lost trying to find help, that I'd finally managed to locate his body after 2 days of searching. They seemed satisfied with my explanation, especially after the medical examiner confirmed that Robert's lungs were full of creek water. I never mentioned the things that had worn his face, or the ancient hunger that had been feeding in those remote pools. Some truths are too dangerous to share, and some evils are better left buried in the deep places of the world. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees outside my apartment, I hear Robert's voice calling my name, and I remember that hunger is patient, and evil is resourceful, and the wilderness is vast enough to hide secrets that predate human civilization. I never went camping again, and I never forgot the lesson I learned in those dark woods of South Dakota, that some friends can be lost in ways that make death seem like a mercy, and that the only thing worse than losing someone you care about is having them come back wrong. The iron knife sits in a drawer in my kitchen now, wrapped in red cloth like a sacred relic. I tell myself it's just a camping tool, just a piece of steel and wood with no special properties. But sometimes I take it out and hold it, remembering how it felt when it touched something older and hungrier than human understanding, just in case I ever need it again. Just in case the hunger finds another way to reach me in the world of electric lights and cell phone towers and the comfortable illusion that we've conquered the wild places. Because deep down, I know the truth that Robert learned too late. We never really leave the wilderness behind. It's always there, waiting just beyond the edge of our vision, patient and eternal and hungry for the next lost soul who wanders too far from the light.